Some folks were asking for a new set of short stories, and I literally got one shot by that Burger King foot lettuce disease that's going around, so what the heck. Here's a set of assorted scary true stories from viewers about tall, thin monsters, demons that love high places, and things that go tap at your window after dark. I'm Darkness Prevails. This is Unexplained Encounters. Don't eat fast food lettuce right now, and let's begin. Dogman in Turkey. From EMZ CKGZ 27. This story begins in Turkey, where I'm from. I love my home country. The wilderness, the food, the animals, all of it. But after this happened, I'll never look at it the same way again. It all happened at 12:34 a.m. on Sunday, the 26th of July. We have 4 or 5 stray cats that live around here, which I usually feed lamb liver at night. After I empty out the little box the liver comes in, I throw it into the bin, which is around 10 to 15 feet away from the entrance to the property. We only have one streetlight, right in front of our house, and none around the corner to the right of it. That road is long, completely dark, and leads to our neighbor's house. Anyway, as I was approaching the large metal bin to throw away the liver box and the little scraps of meat stuck to it, I heard a deep growl. It kind of sounded like a man trying to sound like a wolf or a large dog. I'm not quite sure how to better explain it. It didn't sound exactly like a wolf, and it didn't sound exactly like a man. As a matter of fact, it didn't sound like anything I've ever heard before. Now and then we do get stray dogs that pass by. Some bark and some snarl, and some just walk by peacefully. But this sounded far too heavy for a normal stray dog, and far too deliberate. I turned around, slowly and cautiously, trying not to startle whatever was standing about 15 to 20 feet in front of me. I could barely see it, because the streetlight didn't quite reach where it was standing. All I could make out were 2 glowing yellow eyes, and I could smell a horrible stench coming from the creature, like rotten flesh mixed with spoiled eggs. The eyes were surprisingly high off the ground, around 8 or 9 feet. It growled again, a loud, deep, bone-rattling growl. It bared long, knife-sharp canines. In fact, every single tooth in its mouth looked razor-sharp. I didn't know what to do. My body completely froze, brain racing through thousands of thoughts at once. What is this? Could it be? Then the enormous creature took one slow step towards me. I could finally see it more clearly. Instead of paws, it had human-like feet and long claws in each toe, if they were even toes. Its fur was a dark gray with patches of brown scattered across its body, presumably dried blood. Its hands ended in even longer claws. I could make out its head now, too. It had a long snout, a pointed nose, and ears that curled slightly at the tips, like horns. It was still snarling, still making some kind of noise I can't describe. I simply don't have the words for it. Its entire body was unnaturally muscular. It had incredibly broad shoulders, yet its legs were strangely long and thin, making the proportions look horribly unnatural. I still couldn't move. Even though every instinct screamed at me to run away, my body refused to do a thing. I was shaking uncontrollably. My blood had turned to ice. The thing inched closer, patiently. I genuinely believed I was going to die right there. Then, thank God, I heard my dad shout my name. I had taken far too long to take out the rubbish, which obviously worried him. But I wasn't taking out the rubbish anymore. I was standing frozen in place while this thing stared straight through me, as if it were looking into my soul. The creature turned towards the direction of my dad's voice and vanished. It sprinted back down the dark road around the corner faster than anything I'd ever seen. I finally snapped out of it and bolted back up the stairs into my safe, 4-walled home. I started tearing up, probably due to all of the adrenaline, fear, and emotions, all catching up to me at once. I tried to explain everything to my parents. I doubt they believed me. After I finished, I noticed they were smirking at one another before continuing to watch TV. Eventually, I calmed down a bit. I brushed my teeth, took a shower, and read a book before preparing for bed. Think that was the end? No, not even close. I was hoping that would be the end of it, that this creature would never come back, and life would simply go back to normal. God, I wish that was the case. You see, I sleep in our living room. Our house was still being worked on at the time, so I had to. My bedroom wasn't finished yet, and we hadn't installed curtains. Every single window in that house was exposed. I think you can already guess where this might be going. I set up the couch where I slept. Right beside it, slightly elevated, was a large window. It had no bars, no shutters, and nothing on it. It was a bare sheet of glass. 3 hours passed. I couldn't sleep. It must have been around 3 a.m. by then, maybe 4. I couldn't tell. I kept replaying what happened outside in my head. What if my dad had never called me? What if I'd been just a bit farther away? What would it have done if it reached me? Normally, I'd hear insects, birds, or the occasional cricket outside. Tonight, there was nothing. Just absolute silence. I tried to force myself to sleep. My mom was asleep on the couch opposite mine, and my dad was snoring on the small air mattress we bought in London before flying here. Suddenly, I heard a tap at the window. My heart instantly dropped, my stomach twisting into a knot. Was it back? Had it found me? My brain began to race again. More adrenaline began to flow through my body. I slowly turned to my right, very, very slowly. There it was. The same glowing yellow eyes. The same curled ears. Its heavy breathing fogging up the window. And once again, it was growling. I could no longer move. I couldn't budge to wake my mother. I couldn't scream to wake my dad. I could only watch. Then, the most horrifying thing happened. It smiled. That's right, it smiled like a man. Its sharp yellow teeth slowly revealed themselves as it grinned at me. Then another thump echoed through the room. It placed one of its hands against the glass, slowly rubbing it in circles, as if it was mocking me. Our house sat around 5 or 6 feet from the ground. The window was even higher, yet this thing could easily press its head, shoulders, and upper body against it. It was far taller than I'd first realized. That made everything even worse. Then it started to knock, softly, almost carefully, as though it didn't want to wake anybody else. A moment later, it stopped smiling. It bared every single tooth in its mouth at me and growled louder than before, and the knocking became heavier. Thump, thump, thump. I honestly thought it was trying to break in, trying to get inside, and this continued for I don't know how long. That's when I heard a voice. Oh my God. It was my mom. She had seen everything, and she immediately began to pray. My mother was a deeply religious woman. By some miracle, I think her prayers worked. The creature stopped. It bent down and ran away. From the sound of it, it went down to all fours to run. Eventually, I could no longer hear it. All too slowly, daylight began to appear. The birds returned. The insects started to hum again. Life sounded normal. My mom finally realized I hadn't been making the whole thing up, and we both cried together, until my dad woke up and saw us. I'm sure he thought we were crazy, so we explained everything to him, and with my mom now backing me up, he simply nodded, turned around, and called my uncle. We stayed with my uncle for a time, far away from our village, and we stayed there until our house was finally finished. We installed bars on the windows, put up 3 security cameras. Thank God we never saw that hellish nightmare again. Let this story be a warning. The wilderness of Turkey may look beautiful, but sometimes the things hiding inside it aren't. A Maid's Tale. From Timber. This is not my story. This is a story told to me by a friend of mine, who was told this story by her mother, who was told this story by her mother too. It's a very old story, passed down generation after generation, all the way from 1899. My friend gave me permission to tell this story here, so here we go. Way back when, all the way back to the year 1899, there lived a wealthy family on a large plot of land somewhere in or near Appalachia, although the exact location has blurred over the years. Some folks say this took place in Pennsylvania, others say Tennessee or Kentucky. Nobody knows for sure anymore. The focus of this story, however, is a young servant, 14 years old at the time, who came to work for this family at the young age of only 10, after her own parents were killed in a farming accident. She was born poor, a farm girl through and through, who never imagined she'd be living in a mansion caring for a wealthy man's heir and his young betrothed fiancée. For the sake of this story, I'm going to call this maid Trudy. Trudy began working for this family at the birth of their young girl. We'll call her Mary, as was still rather common among aristocracy at the time. Little Mary was promised to the other family's young son, only weeks after her birth. There was quite an age difference between them, but again, this wasn't uncommon at the time. Trudy, only 7 years old and carrying the fresh trauma of being orphaned, was handed little Mary the day she was born. The family was far from short-staffed. Cleaning, cooking, and such were taken care of already. Therefore, Trudy, having been taken in and hired mostly out of pity, was designated to look after the children. At the time of this story, we assumed that Mary was around age 7, while her teenage fiancé, I'm going to call him Cal for the sake of the story, was around 17. Now, despite their notably snooty parents, Cal and Mary spent much of their days trailing behind young Trudy. Mary saw Trudy as more of a mother than anything, and Cal, well, he tried to appear indignant at the idea of someone younger than him, a girl no less, being in charge of him. In truth, though, Trudy was one of the very few sources of love and attention the boy had. His mother was cold, and his father cared far more about showing off his son than actually being a father. And so Trudy it was for these youngsters. She wasn't required to, but having spent her entire life up until this point on a farm, Trudy very much enjoyed that type of work. Obviously, the spoiled rich weren't about to argue with anyone who wanted to do extra work. Therefore, Trudy acquired just about as many farm chores as she wanted, just so long as she watched the children as well. That meant, of course, tagging them along with her. While their parents spent days sipping tea and engaging in endless gossip, Cal and Mary got to spend their days outside, in the fresh air. As kids should, if you ask me. They passed the time riding horses, collecting eggs, and learning to milk cows and goats. Little Mary took her naps in the barn loft. Cal became rather skilled at breaking green horses, and sometimes Trudy would wake the two of them up late at night to come see whatever new calf, foal, or baby goat had been born. Between that summer and her birth, Mary would rest in a wrapped shawl on Trudy's back, until she was old enough to toddle around behind her. Meanwhile, Cal would come in at night, smelling like hay and animals, earning a scoff from his father that the boy very quickly decided to ignore. Life was good. Not for a single day had any of them felt unsafe on that big farm, until the summer of 1899. By this point, 17-year-old Cal had developed somewhat of a broody, tough guy personality, as many teenage boys do. This detail will be important later. One early morning, little Mary had snuck outside to check on the newest calf in the herd, but had run back inside, screaming and crying. Trudy was in her robe and downstairs in seconds, as the poor little girl cried hysterically in her arms, blubbering out a story that could only be understood in bits and pieces. She took Trudy by the hand, dragging her outside to the barn in her slippers. The grass was still covered in dew, and fog hung low in the field. By this point, Cal, along with the adults, had been woken up by all the commotion, so they followed Trudy and little Mary out to the barn. What they found was horrific. The newest calf, only a day or so old, had been slaughtered in the barn, strewn everywhere, the smell of blood mixing with wet hay. The panicked mother cow was backed against the far wall, eyes wide and breathing hard. It took everything Trudy had not to scream and cry herself as she picked up Mary, clutching the child to her chest as she took a few steps back, reaching behind herself and taking Cal by the hand. When she looked up at the boy, he was pale. Eyes swimming with tears, he tried desperately to hide from his father. His father, however, was far too busy yelling and swearing about coyotes to notice his son. Coyotes. That's what the adults agreed on, and that's what Trudy told the children. But there was one thing, a detail that Trudy kept to herself, that made her doubt the coyote theory. The barn door had been closed that night. She had latched it herself, and that latch was high enough that Trudy had to reach above her head a bit to reach it, and it was nearly, if not a little more, than 6 feet off the ground. There was no way a coyote could reach that latch, even by accident. That night, Trudy ushered the kids inside sooner than usual. Previous nights, she would stay out late to let Mary catch fireflies, but not tonight, and no one argued. She helped serve dinner, gave Mary a bath, and tucked in both kids. Although Cal may have been a bit old for that, this night he did not protest. But that whole time her eyes kept drifting to the windows. She double-checked every lock on all the doors and windows, and had a hard time falling asleep that night. At some point during the night, Cal woke up to noises outside. It started as footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps that seemed to be circling the house. He had initially thought maybe it was Trudy, checking on the animals. A reasonable thing to do after what had happened to that poor calf. But these footsteps were too heavy. Trudy was a small girl, too small to be making that much noise. Eventually, the footsteps began to move away, towards the field. Then the cattle started to panic. Cal bolted upright in bed, already swinging his legs over the side. For a moment he considered waking Trudy up, or his father, but being the young man he was, he decided he was old enough and tough enough to check it out on his own, and so he went outside. He stepped out onto the back porch, which faced the cattle, and strained his eyes under the light of the moon. The cows were huddled on one end of the field, pressed so tight against the fence, it looked as if they might break it down. And there in the center of the field, taking long, exaggerated steps toward the herd, was the thing. It was tall. Its posture was hunched, despite having no roof above it out in the open. It had long, lanky arms that would have touched the ground if it hadn't been holding them bunched up at its sides. Its legs were no better, long and bent awkwardly, like a canine forced onto its hind legs. It appeared way too thin, with a bony-looking torso and a neck that was too long. And the head looked too big for that neck. The head was shaped sort of like an elk's or perhaps a horse's, but for Cal it was too hard from that distance to tell, especially given the dark. Cal stood there, frozen on the porch, wide-eyed. He went to take a step back toward the still open door when his foot hit a loose board, making a loud creaking sound in the otherwise nearly silent night. The creature's head snapped around to face him, the head facing opposite the body, like an owl. Then its body swiveled around to match, and it charged at the house. Cal screamed, barreling inside and slamming the door shut, locking it. He ran upstairs, taking 2 steps at a time. The boy barged into Trudy's room, where she was already sitting up in bed, awake, probably having heard him scream. This tough kid who had spent most of his teenage years feigning indifference to just about everything was now bawling like a child a third of his age, crawling up on the bed with Trudy, wrapping himself around her and practically in her lap. Trudy clutched the boy, holding him despite him being considerably taller than her. He could barely get the words out between hiccuping breaths, and all the commotion had woken little Mary, who'd come in crying and scared too. It wasn't long before the whole house was awake. The men of the house and the male servants then marched outside with guns. They searched the property, and a few shots were fired before the men came rushing back inside, just about the same way that Cal had. They never told anyone what they found, what they shot at. But considering that Cal's father hadn't even bothered to scold or roll his eyes at his sobbing teenage son, Trudy assumed that they had seen it too. After that night, they never saw it again, never lost any more animals either. The women and children were ordered to stay inside after dark, but that was all that came of it. According to the story, some think that the men shot and killed the creature that night. Others think it simply moved on, not wanting humans aware of its presence. Nobody knows for sure. And of course, I don't know how much of this is true or not. But I will say one thing. For a story to be passed down for over 100 years, not changing much at all between tellings, I'd say somebody absolutely saw something that night. Many legends are not some trend for attention. Folks have been seeing strange things and nightmarish things for a very long time. It was in the school. From Mountain Lover 9245. Ever since I could remember, I've had a fascination with the paranormal. That includes ghosts, cryptids, abandoned places, disappearances, anything that couldn't be explained. That's the kind of stuff I wanted to know more about. I would spend hours upon hours watching documentaries or being on forums, listening to people tell their stories about things that most people would never see. I always wanted to believe, but I never thought that it would really happen to me. I thought it was something that only happened to other people. I was wrong. If you've ever watched videos about cryptids or ghost stories, then what I'm about to say might give you second thoughts. Whether you believe me or not is a different story, but I know what I witnessed, and I wish I'd never seen it. I lived in a small farming community in Montana, about 20 miles outside of Billings. It was a small town. The roads were quiet and fields of grass surrounded the city. At night, all you could hear was the wind, coyotes, and the occasional train. Nothing much ever really happened here. Our school was the same way. It was a small school. We only had about 60 kids graduating each year. Some kids would tell stories about hearing footsteps in the empty hallways, lights turning on and off by themselves. Teachers would joke about that, and most people would just laugh it off. So would I. Since my house was only a few blocks away from the school, I decided to get a custodian job at the place. I filled out an application, and a few days later I got an email saying that I got the job. My first day was going to be October 16th, which happened to be my birthday. Now, I wasn't the biggest fan of working that night, but it was a job. Before I go any further, let me just give you a little background on the school. When you walked in the high school doors, the office was to your right. To your left was a wide staircase that led up to the second floor. Straight ahead was the common area. It was a large open room where kids could congregate during lunch and before class. Upstairs, the building opened up into a few long hallways with classrooms. One hallway led to the gym, another to the science building, and one overlooked the common area from a mezzanine. The building was always busy during the day, but at night, it was a different story. The fluorescent lights would buzz, every sound you heard or made would echo, pipes would rattle, the building would make weird popping noises as it cooled down for the night. But all of this wasn't anything out of the ordinary. No, the out-of-the-ordinary things waited until October 29th, 2019. I was walking up to the school doors at about 7:45 that evening. It was a nice October night. My breath came out in clouds as I walked up to the doors. Inside, the building was quiet, except for the buzzing lights. Standing next to the custodian supplies was Hannah. At the time, she was my girlfriend, and as of recently, she's my wife. We both worked for the school, and neither one of us knew that the other would be there that night. We both smiled and made small talk about how lucky we were before heading upstairs to start cleaning. For the first hour or so, we cleaned the rooms and talked about our day. It was a slow night, nothing crazy. We swept the floors and took out the trash. Then we cleaned the windows. A usual night for us. We had done this 100 times. Suddenly, Hannah stopped cleaning and looked right at me. Just outside the room we were cleaning was one of our mop buckets. It was about half full of dirty water and lying on its side. We'd put it there only a few minutes ago. Water was all over the hallway floor as if someone had kicked the bucket over, but neither of us had heard anyone walking by. There wasn't supposed to be anyone else in the building, and neither I nor Hannah had done that. Even so, Hannah frowned and asked, "Did you knock that over?" I shook my head. "No, I thought you did." We both looked at the puddle of water on the floor. It wasn't anything that made me think that something was terribly wrong. Maybe we didn't put it down right. Maybe someone from another shift had walked by and we didn't know it. I shrugged it off. Looking back, I wish I hadn't. Around 9:30 that night, the building started to get quiet. It was unusually still. The air conditioning had stopped. The pipes didn't even rattle. All the noises were absent, as if to make room for what followed. Footsteps. Big, heavy footsteps. They made a loud sound echoing throughout the hallway, like thunk, thunk, thunk. Hannah and I looked at each other. I thought it was another custodian who had stayed after hours. I walked up the hallway and peered outside. There was no one standing there. Instead, something was crawling around the corner. It wasn't walking. It was on all fours. Long, spidery arms stretched out in front of it as it moved. Its skin looked pale, almost ghostly white under the lights. It was thin. I could see every bone in its body. And the way its legs bent was so unnatural. With every step it took, it made this loud, cracking sound. Its fingers scraped against the floor, making a sound that still gives me chills. Slowly, it raised its head and looked at us. That was one of the most disturbing parts, because its eyes looked almost human. That's when something inside me snapped. I knew this wasn't human, that whatever this thing was, it didn't even belong on this earth. Every instinct inside of me was screaming to run. Neither Hannah nor I said a word as we slowly turned around and ran. The nearest place to hide was the janitor's closet, just down the hallway. I threw the door open and practically shoved Hannah inside before slamming the door and locking it behind us. We both stood there, catching our breaths. Neither of us said anything for about a minute straight. Hannah looked up at me, more scared than I've ever seen her. Her face was pale and she was crying silent tears. "What was that?" she whispered. I wrapped my arms around her, trying to comfort both of us, but I had no answer. All I could do was put a finger to my lips. Outside the door, we could still hear the heavy footsteps walking up and down the hallway. Whatever that thing was, it was looking for us. It stopped walking, and we held our breaths. Suddenly, there came a scratching sound against the door. We dared not breathe. It felt as though several minutes passed by before the heavy footsteps began to walk away, and it wasn't until they were gone that we let out a breath. We hugged each other tightly, thinking it was all over, but we would be wrong. A few days later, I was working another night shift. This time, Hannah wasn't there. She'd gone home, and I was partnered up with another custodian by the name of James. The two of us cleaned the school until he was done, and he went on home, which left me to finish the rest of the jobs by myself. By then, the school felt even more frightening. Every empty hallway seemed to stretch on for miles, and every shadow made me jump. I swept the floors, cleaned the windows, and took out the trash. Simple little things that I'd done so much before. But I had a feeling that entire time, the moment James left, that I was being watched. No matter where I was, I had this horrible sensation that someone was looking at me. I kept looking up at the second floor, expecting to see something or someone looking back. Then I heard it. Thunk, thunk, thunk. My heart basically stopped. I slowly turned my head towards the mezzanine. Standing there was the same thing that Hannah and I had seen a few nights ago. It was watching me, long spidery arms dangling down by its knees. Its pale face was emotionless, and its eyes were still the same human-looking eyes I'd seen the other night. Except now, I was alone. We stared at each other, neither one of us moving an inch. My heart pounded so loud that I was sure that it could hear my heartbeat. Then it jumped. Not climbed or crawled, but jumped, and it landed right in front of me with a loud crash, breaking the floorboards underneath us. Before I could react, it was already running across the common area on all fours, It jumped through the large windows of the high school office and disappeared. I stood there, petrified, my brain not registering what just happened. It took a moment, but eventually my body reacted and I ran. I didn't lock the doors. I didn't finish my shift. I didn't even look back. I ran the 2 blocks home faster than I'd ever run in my life. When I made it back, Hannah was waiting for me. She saw the look on my face, how I was out of breath, and she didn't even need to ask what happened. The 2 of us stayed up all night that night. I've heard stories about skinwalkers before, but those stories always came from the Navajo people in the American Southwest. Montana wasn't exactly the place where I thought I would see something like that. Even to this day, I still don't know what that thing was. Maybe it wasn't a skinwalker. Maybe it was something else. Whatever it was, it terrified us enough to make us move out of state. I've never gone back to that school, and even now, when I hear footsteps echoing through an empty building at night, I think about what would have happened if we hadn't run. The Living Shadow, from Void Hunter 6250. I'm posting this in the hope that someone may finally believe me about what happened when the shadows realized I could see them. Let me give you context. I have something called nyctophobia, the extreme and irrational fear of the dark. I won't go into great detail about the side effects, but one of them that I have is seeing and hearing things that isn't there whenever I'm in the dark. However, these visions, or however you want to call them, follow 3 rules that depend on whether I see or hear anything. Rule 1. I have to be anxious or afraid. Rule 2. I have to be around few to no people. And Rule 3, which is common sense. I have to be in the dark. My little visions never broke those rules, and all of them have one thing in common. They were just like pictures, never moving and predictable, because they're based on what I know. That's why I can firmly say what I saw was not due to my phobia. I saw this thing a few times, but the 3 major incidents happened over the span of 2 years. About a year after we moved into this house, when I was 14, my parents went out with their friends, and I was left home alone for the night. I was fine that day. It was dark and I was alone, but I wasn't afraid or anxious at all. So the fact that I saw something confused me. I was in the kitchen and I had just turned the light off, leaving the room, when I saw the window. There was something at the window. A shadow. But no, it was much darker than a shadow. And it looked human, but wrong, with long skinny limbs and a slim body and head. But it had no face. It was just darkness that blocked out all light. My heart stopped for a second when I saw it. I felt fear like never before. Whenever I had these stupid visions, I never saw anything like this. Then I could feel it. It noticed me looking at it. I can't tell you how I knew what it was thinking or feeling, despite it not having any facial features to base it on. I only knew that I could tell. It was surprised I could see it. Then, after a few seconds, that surprise turned into a feeling of joy. Not the kind of joy you get when you can finally talk to someone, but the joy of finding a new toy. I ran quick as I could to my room, slamming the door and feeling panicked, but I didn't hear anything outside. I began to calm down after a while. I blamed it on my phobia, chalking it up to breaking Rule 1 as a special occasion or something. A few months later, I was filming with my friends for a school project. I was calm and surrounded by friends, but it was at night, so it was very dark. Of course, I saw nothing for most of it, but at one point, when my friends were talking, I looked at the window, and there it was, the same figure again, and once again it was looking at me. I felt my heart beating too fast, felt its joy as it saw the fear in me, as if looking through my soul. It had just broken another rule. I wasn't alone this time. Around then I realized I wasn't making this up in my head. because it began to walk towards the open window as if it was going to come inside. I ran to the window and closed it quickly. My friends were confused about why I did that, and I made the excuse that we were letting the air out, or some nonsense that parents use to close windows, and they laughed at me but were fine with it. When I turned back, it was gone, so I calmed myself down. But that image of a solid, dark creature moving toward me broke everything I knew about my random visions. Once again, like an idiot, I slowly convinced myself I was just being a coward, that it wasn't real, it couldn't be, that I was just getting worse. Yet, after that, nothing happened for some time. It was the only living shadow, till then, that didn't follow my rules. About a year passed by before I saw it again. Like the first experience, I was home alone. I'd gone to the kitchen to grab a drink. I was just closing the fridge when I noticed it. The complete lack of sounds. No humming fridge, no bugs buzzing outside, none of our cats meowing, which they always do. It was a dead and eerie silence. I looked around, my pulse quickening. I was trying to figure out what caused this silence. I wish I had just gone back to my room. In the corner, I found it, staring at me. I froze then, unable to move. It was much taller than I previously thought. It had to duck a bit to keep from hitting the ceiling, so this thing was extremely tall. As I stood there, still not moving, staring at this thing, hoping it wasn't real and would just fade away like the other illusions did. No, it began to walk towards me. Muscle control returned, and I bolted toward my room. This time I definitely heard it. Footsteps, loud ones, behind me as I ran. I threw my water at it to slow it down, but it went through it, as if it wasn't there. I ran hard and got to my room, light filling my sight as I jumped onto my bed and pulled a weapon off my wall, brandishing it, ready to either kill it or die trying. My fight-or-flight instinct was so high at that moment. Can you blame me? I had no place to run. My adrenaline was at max. Then I saw it. It crawled through the hallway, head and arms first. Then it did something I wish I could forget, something I wish I could erase from my mind. It smiled at me. I thought it was dark before, but something like the void itself appeared in its face, making two dark eyes and a smile that went from ear to ear, with a mouth full of jagged teeth, and it appeared happy at my fear, or mocking me for grabbing a weapon as if I was some coward, and I think both of us knew that that weapon was not going to do much. It began to laugh then, at least I think it was a laugh, but sounded more like water and blood rising up in someone's throat. It sent shivers down my spine. I was so relieved to be in the light, where I assumed it couldn't go. But I was wrong about that too. Its hand reached around the hallway wall, straight into the light, breaking the one rule I thought shadows could never. It walked into the light. I've never been so afraid. Finally, as if done playing with me, it crawled back and left me there. I stayed like I was for a few more minutes, before getting up, closing my door, and locking it. I was terrified. I couldn't stay in that room. I couldn't stay in that house anymore. I don't know why I did this. Maybe it was stupid, but I was young and scared. I grabbed a knife and a flashlight and bolted to my car, which I had just gotten that month. I got in with no issues and closed and locked the door, but when I looked up, it was there, standing by a nearby light. I could feel it was now annoyed with me, knowing that I was trying to leave, annoyed that its toy would no longer play with it. The thing rushed at my car as I started it, and I began to back up. I heard this growl or scream. I can't really tell which one fits it better, but that noise came out of the thing's mouth. As I drove away, it chased me roughly a mile before giving up. I waited at a busy gas station until my parents were ready for me to grab them from their event. After that day, I didn't see the figure again. I assumed it was mad at me for trying to leave. Maybe it just got bored. Whatever it wasn't just my mind messing with me. It was no hallucination. It was something very real, something tormenting me for the fun of it. My fear got a lot worse after that. I can't even step outside the house at night if there's no light. I hope that if anyone sees this and it ends up hunting you, please just run. Because no matter what you do, you cannot kill a shadow. It learned from us. From That Outdoors Lover 5577. I'm 23 and live in England, but I was 11 years old when this story took place. It happened in May of 2014, when I was on holiday in Cornwall with my mom and grandparents. We were staying in a place I will leave unnamed, but for the story, all you need to know is that it was near Truro. So let's begin. My mom's parents, my grandparents, were in Truro, near where we were staying, so we decided to go to Goonhilly Reserves. Goonhilly is a World War II communication site. It has gargantuan satellite dishes you can see from miles around. It was a nice drive, the fields, the woods, and listening to a scary story on audiobook. We arrived and parked the car. It was a bright and sunny day. We were walking the trail, so imagine open fields, bright sunshine, trees lining the side of the trail. We had been walking for about 10 minutes when I noticed, just to the side of the trail, an entrance leading into a concrete, graffiti-covered square building. I looked at my mom. She nodded, so we went in. Inside this concrete structure, it was cold and dry. It seemed to have its own micro-environment inside. After you entered, there was a hallway running from left to right, with loads of plants growing all over the walls and floor. To the right was a stairway made of metal, with more hallways underneath. I went up and realized it was quite a big building. Also, a little side note. There were signs on the roof that said the building we were in was the World War II Dry Tree Site, a secret Royal Air Force early warning radar station built in 1940. But back to the story. I looked around and saw nothing but wilderness. But suddenly, this paranoia kicked in. I walked back down and looked down the hallway. Mom was standing in the inner door with my dog Winnie, a Shih Tzu breed. Then I saw the gutter, and my heart stopped. Because there, tucked in amongst the dry leaves and empty sweet wrappers, was a carving knife, covered in blood. A few yards down the hall was a door, pitch black inside. I looked in, and then I heard this sound. A ripping noise. But not just any ripping noise, but meat being torn. Because in that room, there was something there. Something that looked like a man and sat like a man, but obviously was not. It was tall, skinny, and deathly pale. It sat in the corner, only just illuminated by the light through a door, crouched over, eating something red and dripping. That's where the noise had come from. That's why that knife was there and covered in blood. The idea of something that wasn't human, using tools, that freaked me out, and I was already losing my mind at whatever this thing was. I immediately ran out of the room and into the hall once again. I put on a poker face, just telling her the room was empty and that we should leave to continue the walk. My mom didn't suspect anything. Good, but I eventually did tell her what I saw. After we left the building, I was on edge for the rest of the journey. We passed a few more buildings, some greatly hidden, some just laid out in the open. Seeing the giant satellite snapped me out of my trance for a couple of seconds. I guess gazing up at the beautiful things must have put me in awe. This is basically the end of the story. But I'll tell you this. When climbing back into my mom's car, I saw that thing again, watching me from the top of the same building. I didn't say a word for about 15 minutes. When my mom asked what was wrong, I spilled the beans entirely. She didn't believe me, saying, and I quote, "You would have told me about it sooner." But I know what I saw. If you ever hear meat ripping in some building, you'd better leave before something notices you. It knocked on my wall. From I'm Addicted to Black Coffee. I've been listening to this podcast for a while. I know the story I'm about to share is on the shorter side, and probably won't scare most people. But it's been over a year now since it happened, and I still have not been able to come up with an explanation. I'm not a skeptic per se, but I always try to think of every possibility and get all the data I can before coming to a conclusion. So if anyone has any idea as to what might have caused this, please let me know. Just over a year ago, me and my family went to stay in a cabin we found on Airbnb in a little tourist town. It's out in the middle of the woods in bear country. It takes at least half an hour of driving through dirt roads on steep hills and rocks to get to a store, and another half hour to get to the small town. My room was the attic. It was very nice, with a pool table and a dartboard. A teenage boy's dream, really. The only downside was that you had to climb up a long flight of stairs to get to it. My room had bunk beds, and the morning this happened, I was sitting on the top bunk. On the other side of one of the walls is a locked room, one that the family who owned the house kept their things in when renting it. The other wall had the forest right outside. I was up early, can't remember why, but it was around 5 in the morning. I was sitting on the blankets reading a book, which I'd gotten from a store the previous day. Suddenly there was a loud knock on the wall, right by my bed, not even 5 feet from the foot of my bed. It was so loud I swear I saw the wall shake. It wasn't like a person knocking, it was too loud, too intense for that. It was like someone threw a weight at the wall, only that would have sounded like a thud, not the sound of someone rapping their knuckles on wood. It was almost like someone was asking to enter, but there was no door there, just a wooden wall. I jumped and shook for a few minutes after. As I mentioned, I was in the attic, far, far up from the ground, and so was that locked room. I asked my family about it at breakfast, but they brushed me off. I asked my sister, who's a few years older than me, and the only other one who had a chance of being awake that early in the morning. Her room was near mine, just at the foot of the stairs on ground level. I asked if she had heard it. I don't remember exactly what she said, but it was something like, "I'm not sure. I don't know if I was awake then." I know that she couldn't have made that knock. She was too far away, and the only possibilities I can think of are that something very, very tall knocked on my wall at 5 in the morning, or that something in that locked room did it. I've talked to my partner about this experience. He doesn't have an explanation either. It still keeps me up at night, wondering what knocked on my wall and why it did. This is the only experience I've had like this. I desperately hope someone has some idea what happened that morning, because I sure as hell don't. The Hill. From Anonymous. I've never put this story to paper before. Of the small circle of people I've related to, they've all said they would pay me not to hear it a second time. I was born and raised smack dab in the middle of Maryland, a truly excellent place to grow up in and get a head start on life. Throughout my childhood, I heard stories of a place up in the hills not far away from the part of my hometown I lived in. Strange and unsettling stories, with several of them having an absolutely evil note to them. For the sake and safety of those reading this, I would not like to give the proper name, or even the nickname of this location, as I cannot discourage people enough from going there, no matter what you believe about the supernatural. Although anyone who grew up in this area of a relatively small state, or anyone with an interest in such things, will probably know or be able to find out the true name. So for the sake of my story, I'll refer to it as The Hill, as it does indeed lie upon one of the aforementioned hills. The true part of its history is that the hill was the site of a former Catholic seminary, which operated from the late 19th century until sometime in the early 70s, when it was then closed and abandoned for a myriad of reasons. Fast forward about 25 years, and much of what was left of the derelict property was gutted by a mysterious fire, leaving nothing but the haunting bones of 1800s infrastructure. At some point afterward, so many people made their way up the hill to explore that the property owners employed a security guard and his dogs. The guard was subsequently arrested and charged with battery after brutally assaulting a trespasser with the butt of his firearm. In the decades since its abandonment and destruction, many tales have been told about the hill that cause reactions ranging from skeptical laughs to blood running cold. Stories of satanic activity, animal sacrifices, faces in the trees, disembodied voices, and mysterious lights. Speaking for myself and a former student of my father's, those stories came true. My father works in teaching. He's one of those teachers who become so influential and fatherly in young people's lives that they still come back years, often decades later, to see him. He, like myself, is a very devout Catholic, and having grown up in the same area, he had heard the stories about the hill and had always warned me to stay away from that place, whether I thought the stories were true or not. One day, when I was in middle school, he came home and told me about an experience one of his students had regarding a trip up to the hill with his friends. They went up one night to explore and drink, and while there, this student said he had this nagging feeling of unease, as if a malicious intent was bent upon him. He chalked it up to nerves and the creepiness of the woods at night, and left with his buddies. A few days later, he noticed that his pets would not come near him, and if he attempted to get close to them, they would growl or hiss aggressively. He then began having nightmares about faces he could not make out, but that he knew were watching him, and would wake up with bruises and scratches that stung like salt had been rubbed in them. Finally, one day, he told my father, as he was driving down the road, he almost thought he felt a weight suddenly materialize on the back of his car, and when he looked in the rearview mirror, he said he almost careened into the opposite lane of traffic out of shock and horror. He described a face unlike anything that naturally walks the earth, green and scaly, with yellow reptilian eyes, and it was attached to his trunk with a vice-like grip. He was able to pull over, and once he emerged from the car, the being was gone. But there were dents on either side of the trunk, like powerful hands had squeezed the metal like putty. My father asked him if he felt comfortable making a sketch of it, and once the student had, my father said to me that even the rough, unskilled drawing made him feel more uncomfortable than he would have cared to admit. He immediately phoned a very close priest friend of his, and the priest blessed the student, telling him things he could do to combat negative feelings or presences if they persisted. I have no idea if the student ever saw this entity again, but it's safe to say the story scared me away from any desire to go up the hill, at least for a while. Fast forward to spring break of 2018. I'd gone home and was out fishing with a friend at a nearby pond. This was mid-March. It was a spectacular day, 74 degrees and sunny. After a while and a few beers, I suggested we go check out an old decrepit paper mill along the river, not far from the hill. That too was a popular urban exploration spot, albeit lacking the same mystery of its sinister neighbor. At some point, I looked up the ridge and knew that we were not far from that old property, which is why I suggested it. To my surprise, my buddy, who can usually be somewhat of a scaredy cat, agreed. The pedestrian path up to the hill is marked by a long, overgrown staircase made of granite. Once you reach the top, the woods are speckled with relics and monuments of the long-gone seminary. Foundations, hollowed-out buildings, corner posts, and a heavily graffitied altar. I looked up some of these online, and had found that somewhere through a tunnel cut into the bushes, there was a car graveyard, full of the skeletons of old Hudsons, Fords, and T-Birds. We actually managed to find said tunnel, but at this point my friend said that he did not feel right about continuing, and wanted to leave. I pressured him into this one last venture, and we went through the brush. Indeed, on the other side was said graveyard. It was quite impressive to see just how many vehicles had made their way up there and just died. It was then that out of nowhere, a fierce cold enveloped us like an invisible cell, and on this 74-degree sunny day, our breath began to come out in thick wisps like it was the middle of winter. We were creeped out and quickly made our way out, back towards the stairs. As we passed by the altar, I suddenly stopped, and I felt as if an arm had wrapped itself around my midsection. I felt the strongest urge imaginable that I should return to the car graveyard. My deepest consciousness knew that I did not want to, but something else was almost pleading with me that I should go back. My buddy then grabbed me and brought me out of this sort of trance, explaining that when he looked back at me just now, There was a quick flash on my face, as if I had aged 100 years in a second. That was more than enough for us, so we got back to our car quickly, and we've never gone anywhere near the hill since. Even as I write this, I can feel that cold we felt. Sure, my story is not as viscerally frightening as my father's students, but nonetheless, they're both cautionary accounts. Do not investigate this location. I implore you to never go up the hill. I have no doubts that whatever energy or supernatural influence is up there is an evil one. It's not worth jeopardizing yourself or your friends merely for a peek into local history. The hill is where it belongs, in the past. Be content to let it stay there. I like the name, The Hill. Like this very haunted evil place is also a metaphor for a treacherous upward journey. For me, all I heard was how old I'm getting. That's my upward journey. I miss when I could wake up in my bed without feeling half dead in the morning. That's another upward journey, getting up from my bed. Good night. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Unexplained Encounters. I've been your host, Darkness Prevails. You can find me on X at Dark Prevails, and you can send me your scary true stories of the unknown at darkstories.org. If you want to support what I do, check out Erie.fm, where you can sign up for premium membership to get bonus stories, members-only audiobooks, and 0 ads. You can also support us for free and get some folklore-related content by watching and subscribing to the Freaky Folklore YouTube channel. Just go on YouTube and look up Freaky Folklore. If you see a cute little character with antlers, you've come to the right place. Till next time, everyone, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.
Hi, welcome to Dead and Roasted. What can I get you?
Something rare happened with tonight's first 2 stories. They were sent to me years apart by 2 people who have never met, and they both describe encountering what seems to be the same thing in the same stretch of Appalachian West Virginia. When I say the same thing, I mean the descriptions match well enough to give me chills. So we're gonna open with both of these accounts back to back, and after that we've got more tales from the working world featuring some very unwelcome visitors of the non-human variety, and more. These are tales from the break room. It walked wrong, from Danny 94. I need to get a few things straight before I tell this, because people always ask the same questions about it. Yes, I'm a woman who works in utility line inspection, and yes, I work alone a lot of the time. I carry a sidearm when I'm in the field, because my work often takes me to remote areas which have bears and the occasional angry landowner. I don't carry it because I'm paranoid. I carry it because my company requires it for field technicians working solo in bear country. And I've had exactly one encounter with a copperhead that made me glad I had something louder than my voice on me. I've been doing this for about 8 years, and I've seen plenty of weird stuff in the woods, like dead animals arranged in strange ways, almost intentionally, or old structures that aren't on any map. Imagine chimneys standing alone where a cabin used to be, and root cellars with the doors still intact that you'd swear someone was using recently, even though the nearest occupied property was 5 miles away. I even found a school bus once, just sitting in the middle of nowhere about a mile from the nearest road, completely gutted, with small trees growing up through the floor. You could see where the seats had been. The windshield was gone, but the rearview mirror was still attached, and when I walked past it, I caught my own reflection and nearly screamed. The Appalachian backcountry is full of things that don't make sense, and you learn just to note them down, report what's relevant, and keep moving. I thought I'd seen the weirdest things those mountains have to offer, but I was wrong. In the fall of 2021, I was inspecting a stretch of transmission line that runs through a pretty remote area of Pocahontas County. This is a deep mountain country, rugged, elevations over 4,000 feet in places, covered in dense hardwood forest that goes red and gold in October and looks beautiful from a distance, but up close it's just a wall of trees in every direction. A lot of national forest land, not a lot of people. I can go whole days without seeing another person. Sometimes that's nice, right? But other times not so much. My job that day was to walk a section of the right-of-way, which is the cleared corridor under the power lines, and check for vegetation encroachment, damaged poles, anything that needed to be flagged for a crew. It's about as boring as it sounds most of the time. You walk and you look up, you take photos, and you write notes on a tablet. The right-of-way is usually about 100 feet wide, so you've got the open strip under the lines and then dense forest on both sides. It feels like walking down a hallway with living walls. I'd been out since about 7 a.m. It was probably close to 2 in the afternoon when I noticed something was off. I was in a section where the terrain dropped away to the east into a hollow, and the tree line on that side was thick second-growth hardwood, mostly beech and maple with a lot of undergrowth. I had stopped to photograph a leaning pole when I caught movement in my peripheral vision, somewhere down the slope in the trees. I looked, expecting a deer, but what I saw was not a deer at all. There was a figure standing about 60 yards away, just inside the tree line where the shadows were heaviest. It was upright, on 2 legs, and very tall, taller than any person I've ever seen. And I don't mean like a tall basketball player. I mean proportionally wrong tall, with long limbs, arms hanging down past where the knees would have been. And it was so thin, extremely thin, with a grayish color that was close enough to the bark of the beech trees that I almost didn't register it. It was just standing there, slightly angled, like it was leaning to look around a tree without stepping out from behind it. I froze. My first thought, and I know this is going to sound ridiculous, was that someone had placed a mannequin in the woods as a joke, because the proportions were so wrong that my brain was trying to categorize it as something artificial, something man-made. The arms were just too long and the head was just too small. Or maybe it was the right size, but looked small, because the body was so stretched out. I couldn't make out a face. The whole thing was just this pale gray shape standing in the shadows. And then it moved. It shifted its weight from one leg to the other, and the way it moved was the part that really got to me. You know how when a person shifts their weight, their whole body adjusts? Hips and shoulders, head, everything sort of flows together, because that's how your skeleton works. Well, this thing didn't do that. Parts of it moved independently. The legs shifted, but the upper body stayed rigid, and then the upper body sort of caught up in a jerky, delayed way. Like a robot or a marionette. I put my hand on my holster. Honestly, I don't know why, because I don't think a 9mm would have been my first choice if that thing had come at me. But it was a reflex. I kept watching. It shifted again. And then it turned. And when I say turned, I mean the whole body rotated to face me. But the head stayed fixed on me the entire time. The body turned underneath the head that was already looking at me. I don't know how else to describe it. The head simply didn't move. The body swiveled to match it. That stare down between us lasted about 15 seconds. I could hear my own breathing and the hum of the power lines above me. But there was nothing else. No wind or birds. The woods had gone completely quiet. That's when I saw the thing take a step backward, deeper into the trees. And I lost sight of it. It didn't walk away. It sort of just receded into the shadows, like that Homer Simpson meme, like the forest swallowed it. I left. I walked back to my truck at a pace that I will generously call brisk, and I did not look back. I wanted to run very badly, but the rational side of my brain told me that running through uneven terrain with equipment on my back was a good way to trip and break an ankle, and breaking an ankle out here alone, with that thing in the woods, was not an option I was willing to consider. It took me about 20 minutes to get back to my truck, the longest 20 minutes of my life. Every noise in the woods, every squirrel in the leaves, every branch that popped under my boots made my heart rate spike. When I got to the truck, I locked the doors before I even started the engine, which is something I've never done before or since. I drove to the district office and told my supervisor I'd completed the section, which was a lie because I had another half-mile to go. I went back 2 days later to finish in broad daylight, and I brought a coworker with me. I didn't tell him why I brought him along. He thought I just wanted company, and that was fine by me. I've never seen it again. I've been back through that area multiple times since, but every time I'm in that section, the hair on my arms stands up, and I move faster than I usually would. I scan the trees constantly, instead of just checking the poles and the lines. My body remembers what my brain tries to forget. Something lives in those woods. It's tall, gray, and wrong, and it watches. The Tall Gray, from GMC Farland, 22. So I don't usually submit these kinds of things to the podcasts I listen to. I listen to this show, but I'm a pretty skeptical guy in general. I grew up hunting and fishing and camping, and I've spent a lot of time in the woods, so I don't spook easy. But something happened to me about 4 years back that I've never been able to explain, and it's honestly messed with my head. In 2022, I was working on a survey crew for a natural gas pipeline company. We were doing preliminary route surveys in Randolph County, West Virginia. Lots of mountains, hollows, heavy forest, and not many people around. Our job was to walk potential pipeline routes, taking GPS readings and marking features, assessing the terrain for the engineers. We worked in 2 teams of 2 or 3 and spent most of our time bushwhacking through stuff that hadn't seen a human footprint in years. My partner was a guy named Cal, late 20s, quiet, but good at his job. The kind of guy you want with you in rough country because he doesn't complain and he pays attention. We were working a route along a ridgeline that dropped off steeply to the north into a drainage that was all old growth, big old hemlocks and poplars. It was October, late in the afternoon, and the light was getting that golden sideways quality it gets in the mountains when the sun drops behind the next ridge over. We'd been working for about 6 hours and were getting ready to call it, when Cal stopped ahead of me and held up his fist. That was our signal to freeze in place. I thought he had spotted a bear. We'd seen bear sign all day, scat and claw marks on trees. He pointed downhill into the drainage without saying a word. Quietly, I went up next to him, and I looked. About 70 or 80 yards below us, standing in a gap between 2 big hemlocks, there was something. My first impression was that this was some person, maybe a man wearing gray, like a gray bodysuit. It was tall, well over 6 feet, thin and standing upright. But even as I thought person in my head, the instinctual parts of my brain told me that wasn't right. That was the wrong answer. The arms were extraordinarily long. They hung at its sides. I swear they almost reached the ground. The head was pretty small relative to the body, or maybe the body was just too big for the head. I wasn't sure how to frame it. But it was standing perfectly still, facing our direction. Its posture looked very stiff. Cal whispered, "What do you think that is?" I shook my head. I didn't have an answer to that. We watched it. I'd estimated we watched it for 2 solid minutes, without either of us moving or saying a word. It stood there with a kind of eerie patience, vaguely humanoid, but we could tell it shouldn't be here. Suddenly it moved. This part made my mouth fall open, because I'd never seen anything move that way. It made this disjointed motion to the left, a step. The leg went first and the body followed, but not fluid in the slightest. It was broken up, like watching a video with dropped frames. Cal grabbed my arm and I could feel his hand shaking through my jacket sleeve. This man was not a man who shook. It took another step, same direction. Then it stopped, and its head rotated towards us like a tank turret. Just the head. It rotated about 45 degrees in our direction. It was looking at us. And still I could not see any features. The whole area where a face should have been was just smooth grayish surface, blank and featureless, pointing right at us from 70 yards away. Cal said to me in a whisper, "We need to go." I agreed. We backed up along the ridge, keeping our eyes on it for as long as we could see it. After about 30 seconds of backing up, it was out of our line of sight behind the terrain, so we turned then and walked fast toward the truck. We didn't speak until we were back in the truck with the doors locked and the engine running. About a mile down the gravel road, Cal asked me what I thought it was. I told him I had no idea. He asked if I thought it was a person, like someone in a costume or a suit. That was something I was sure of. I told him no. I didn't think it was human at all. He agreed. He said the thing that bothered him the most was that face, the lack of a face. He said that when it turned its head towards us, he'd been looking right at it through his scope, and there wasn't anything on that face, just total smoothness like old concrete that had been worn flat. Then he said, "I don't ever want to come back to this section." I told our project manager that we needed to reroute the survey because of terrain issues. Terrain problems are common enough in that area that it wasn't a suspicious excuse. So yeah, I don't know what we saw. I've turned it over in my head 100 times. I've looked it up endlessly over the years too, but the closest things I could find to it might have been the pale crawler or a forest giant, but they don't fit perfectly. This thing was much more rigid, more like something imitating a living creature than something that actually was one. I will say one more thing. About a month after our sighting, I was at a gas station in Elkins, which is the closest real town to where we'd been working, and I overheard two guys in hunting camo talking at the next pump. One of them was saying he'd been scouting for deer up in the Cheat Mountain area and had seen something gray standing in the trees that he thought was a dead tree until it moved. The other guy laughed and said he was seeing things, but the first guy wasn't laughing. His voice was shaky. I almost said something, but I stayed quiet. I got in my truck and I left. The Woman on the Fourth Floor, from Crispy 2001. I worked as a janitor at a hospital in Macon, Georgia, for 3 years from 2018 to 2021. It was a mid-sized regional hospital, 4 floors built in the 1970s and renovated a couple of times since. My shift was 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., and I was responsible for the common areas, hallways, lobbies, cafeteria, and the administrative wing. I didn't clean patient rooms. That was a different crew entirely, a contracted outfit that came in during day shift. So I wasn't in areas where sick or dying people were being cared for. The 4th floor was a mix of admin offices and storage. Half of it was active during the day, people doing billing and records, and whatever else hospitals need office workers for. There were printers running, phones ringing, people complaining about the coffee machine, and things like that. Your normal office stuff. The other half was storage rooms full of old equipment, like filing cabinets and beds that weren't in use, decommissioned monitors, and boxes of paper records from before the hospital went digital. At night, the whole floor was empty. The offices were locked, the lights were off, except for the exit signs and a few security lights in the hallway that gave everything a green-white glow. It was the quietest part of the building, and I usually cleaned it first, just to get it out of the way, so I could spend the rest of my shift on the lower floors, where other people were around. About 6 months into the job, I was mopping the 4th floor hallway around 11:30 at night, when I heard a door close somewhere ahead of me. A soft click, like someone pulled a door shut gently. I looked up and every door in the hallway was closed, which was how they always were at night. I assumed it was the building settling or a draft pulling a door that wasn't latched properly, so I kept on mopping. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps. They were coming from the far end of the hallway, past the bend where the corridor turns toward the storage wing. Soft footsteps on tile. It sounded like someone in regular shoes walking at a normal pace. I stopped and listened for a moment. They continued for about 10 seconds, then stopped. I called out. Maybe a nurse or a security guard had come up for something, but no one replied. I went around the bend and checked the storage wing. The hallway was empty and lit only by that green glow of the exit signs. Every door was closed. I tried a few handles and they were all locked. I went back to mopping again. This happened again the following week. Same thing about the door closing and footsteps, but no one being there. Then it happened again a 3rd time and a 4th time. I mentioned it to the other night staff casually, like, "Does anybody ever go up to the 4th floor at night?" The nurses said no. Security said they did rounds up there once a shift, but not at the times I was hearing things. One of the older security guards gave me a look when I brought it up, and he said, "You hearing her?" I said, "Hearing who?" He told me that people had been hearing a woman on the 4th floor for years. Footsteps, doors, and sometimes a voice. He said a couple of the night nurses had even seen her, too, in the hallway near the storage wing. He described her as middle-aged, wearing a white blouse and a dark skirt. like office clothes, but from a different decade. She would be walking down the hallway, then she'd turn a corner and be gone. One nurse told him she'd followed the woman around the bend and found the hallway empty, every door locked. The security guard said nobody knew who she was for certain. There had been talk over the years about looking into whether someone had died in the building, beyond patients, that is. Perhaps an employee who had a heart attack or a stroke at her desk. An older nurse, a woman who had been at the hospital since the 80s, told that security guard she thought the ghost might be a billing clerk named Ruth Ann or Ruth Ann, something like that. She worked on the 4th floor in the late 1980s and died suddenly. She wasn't sure if the woman died at the hospital or at home, and she couldn't remember her last name, so there was no way to confirm this. But she said that the description fit. Dark hair, white blouse, office clothes. She remembered because the woman always dressed nice, nicer than most of the admin staff, as if she was going to church every day instead of sitting in front of a computer. That security guard said he'd thought about digging into it himself, but ultimately decided against it. "Some things you just let 'em be," he said. "She's been here longer than I have. If she wants to walk the hallway, that's her business." I respected that. He'd been at the hospital for 12 years at that point. He was one of those guys who had seen enough of life that very little bothered him. And she didn't bother me, really. Once I knew what it was, or at least what other people said it was, the footsteps stopped scaring me and just became part of the job. I'd hear them, even call out an "evening, ma'am" under my breath, and I'd keep mopping. I figured if she'd been walking that hallway for 30-something years without hurting anybody, she wasn't about to start with me. But I did see her once, and that one time is the reason I'm even writing this. It was my last month at the hospital, February 2021. I was on the 4th floor later than usual, about 1 a.m. I had to deal with a spill in the cafeteria that ate up my first hour. So I was behind schedule and annoyed about it, which is maybe why I wasn't paying attention to the usual sounds. I was mopping near the bend in the hallway, working fast, earbuds in but no music playing, because I'd learned a long time ago that you don't block your hearing in empty hospital corridors at night. I looked up at some point, and there she was, about 30 feet away, standing in the corridor near one of the storage room doors. She was exactly what that security guard had described. Middle-aged, about late 40s or early 50s, dark hair pinned up in a style that looked like it was from the 80s, maybe early 90s. A white blouse, dark skirt, sensible shoes. She was standing with her hand on the door handle, as if she had just come out of the room, or was about to go back in. She was looking at me, and she was solid. Really think about that. She looked completely real, completely three-dimensional, like another living person standing in a hallway. If I didn't know the floor was empty, if I didn't already know every door was locked, if I didn't know what I knew from 2 years of hearing footsteps and doors and stories, I would have walked up to her and asked if she needed help finding something. That's how real she looked. We looked at each other for maybe 5 seconds. Her expression wasn't scary. She didn't look angry or sad or threatening. She just looked like someone who had noticed me and was mildly surprised I was there, like I'd walked into her office without knocking. Then she turned away from me, opened the door, and walked into the storage room. The door closed behind her with that same soft click I'd been hearing for 2 years. I walked over and tried the handle then. It was locked. I knocked and said, "Hello?" Nothing. I finished my shift, and I never saw her again. I left that hospital for a different job, same profession though, and I still wonder who she was and why she's still there. Needless to say, I believe in ghosts very much now. The Trucker, from Beck's 1987. This isn't a ghost story. I wish it was, because ghosts don't actually do anything. This was a person, a real live human being, and that's what made it so much worse. I was 24 years old, working as a night clerk at a truck stop off I-40 in eastern Oklahoma. I won't name the exact place, but it had big diesel pumps out front, a little convenience store with 4 aisles of snacks and motor oil and air freshener shaped like pine trees, with showers for the truckers in the back, and a diner attached to the side that closed at 10. After 10, it was just me and whoever was buying cigarettes and energy drinks at 2 in the morning. The truck lot out back could hold maybe 40 rigs, and on a busy night, it'd be 3/4 full of guys sleeping in their cabs. Weeknights were slower, maybe 10, 15 trucks. I could see the lot from the counter if I craned my neck. The job was okay. I am a night person by nature, and most of the truckers were decent. Tired and quiet usually. They'd come in, buy their stuff, maybe use the shower, and go back to their truck. Some of them were regulars, and I knew them by name. There was a guy named Ray who drove for Werner, and always bought 2 banana moon pies. There was Carla, who hauled refrigerated loads and would talk your ear off about her grandkids if you let her. Mostly good people. Occasionally, you would get a drunk or a tweaker, but that was rare for our stop, because we were in the middle of nowhere, and the tweakers tended to cluster near the bigger towns where they could get supply. There was one trucker, though, who came through every few weeks, and he made my skin crawl. I never even got his name. He drove a white Peterbilt with no company markings on it, which isn't super unusual for an owner-operator, but his truck was always immaculate, like weirdly clean. Truckers live in their rigs, and the cabs usually look like it. This guy's truck looked like it had just rolled off the lot every single time. He was tall, about 6'2" if I had to guess. Lean, too, always wearing the same tan Carhartt jacket and a ball cap pulled low. He had these pale blue eyes, and he didn't blink nearly enough. I know that's a weird detail to focus on, but it's one of those things that stuck with me. Most people blink every few seconds. This guy would go 20 or 30 seconds at a time without blinking, I swear to God. It made talking to him feel like being studied through some window. He never bought much. A coffee and sometimes a water. He'd pay in cash, exact change too. He never used a card, and he'd leave just like that. He didn't make small talk. He never asked about the weather or road conditions or anything that truckers normally talk about. He would look at me with those pale, steady eyes and say, "Thanks," and walk out. Every single time the same routine and the same word. I started dreading seeing that white Peterbilt pulling into the lot because I knew exactly how the interaction would go, and something about the precision of it unsettled me. The thing that started bothering me beyond the staring was that he'd come inside at odd hours. Most truckers who stop at 2 or 3 a.m. are on a schedule. They've been driving. They need to fuel up and use the bathroom and maybe grab food. Then they're back on the road. This guy would pull in at like 3 a.m., park, then not come inside for almost 2 hours. I'd see his truck in the lot from the window, and the cab light would be on, and he'd be sitting in there. Then at 4 or 5 in the morning, he would finally come in, buy his coffee and sometimes water, and leave. But sometimes he wouldn't leave. He'd go back to his truck, turn the cab light off, and sit there in the dark. I'd seen the faint glow of what I assumed was a phone screen, and that was it. I mentioned this guy to my manager at some point. She said some truckers are just strange, and to let it go, unless he caused trouble, of course. Fair enough. But he never caused trouble. He never raised his voice or made a mess. He never said anything threatening. But one night I was stocking shelves near the front window, and I looked out at the lot. His truck was parked facing the store, cab light off, and he was standing outside his truck, leaning against the driver's side door, looking directly at the store. At me, arms folded, just standing there in the cold at 3 a.m., watching the building. I stepped back from the window and out of the aisle so he couldn't see me. I waited about 5 minutes, and then I looked again. He was gone, but his truck was still there. He simply was no longer next to it. That's when the door chime rang, and he walked in. "Evening," he said. With exact change, he bought a coffee, then walked out and got in his truck. He drove away, and I watched his taillights until they disappeared on the interstate. I started locking the front door after midnight. Company policy said we were supposed to stay open 24 hours, but I told my manager I'd been getting nervous about a specific individual, and she let me start locking up at 1 a.m. and only buzzing people in. She didn't push for details, and I was thankful for that. He came through one more time after that. It was about 3 weeks later, a Wednesday night, dead quiet, maybe 2 trucks in the lot at most. He pulled in and parked in the back of the lot in his usual spot, facing the store. He sat in the cab for about an hour and a half. I knew it was him before I even saw the truck because of where he parked. Nobody else even used that spot. It was the farthest corner of the lot, away from the lights, where you'd park if you wanted to watch the building without being easily seen from inside. I sat behind the counter, and I kept glancing at the security monitor, watching his cab light come on and go off again. Then he got out, and he walked up to the front door and tried the handle. It was locked. He stood there and looked through the glass at me. I was behind the counter about 20 feet away, and we made eye contact through the door. The fluorescent light from inside hit his face, and I could see him clearly. He didn't knock. He didn't try the handle again either. He didn't mouth words or gesture for me to let him in. He stood there looking at me through the door with an unblinking stare, breath fogging up the glass slightly, one hand still on the door handle. Then he smiled. It was the first time I'd ever seen him smile, and I wish I never saw it. It didn't look like a friendly expression. It looked performative, like he was showing me his teeth because he wanted me to see them. Like letting me know that a locked door was a minor inconvenience, and he found it amusing that I thought it would help. He turned around, walked back to his truck, and left. He pulled onto the interstate heading west, and his taillights got smaller and smaller until they were gone. He never came back. I'm not sure why. Maybe he moved on to a different route. Maybe he found a different truck stop with a clerk who didn't lock the door. One way or another, he lost interest. Good, because I never wanted to see him again. The Voice in the Stairwell, from M. Delgado 97. I used to work the front desk at a Marriott in El Paso, Texas, 3 to 11 shift, which meant I'd spend the last few hours of my shift mostly alone in the lobby, since the overnight guy, Tomas, would sometimes be late. He was a good dude, but punctuality was not his strong suit. So from about 10:30 to whenever he rolled in, it was me and the lobby and the security cameras, and whatever guests happened to walk through, which at that hour was usually no one. The hotel was 12 stories, and the stairwells were the concrete echo chamber type with the metal railings, the kind where if you drop your keys on the 5th floor, you can hear them hit from the lobby. Sound carried in those stairwells like you wouldn't believe. A door closing on the 8th floor sounded like it was 2 flights away. There was a night when I was alone at the desk around 10:45. The lobby was empty. The elevator was parked on the ground floor with its doors closed. The TV in the lounge area was off. It was that specific kind of hotel quiet where you can hear the ice machine humming through the wall. I was doing some end-of-shift paperwork when I heard what sounded like a man talking in the east stairwell. The door to that stairwell was about 15 feet from the front desk, a heavy fire door with a push bar. Guests would sometimes use the stairs if the elevator was slow. But at that hour, it was unusual. I assumed someone was on a phone call and didn't think much of it. But the voice kept going, and it wasn't a conversation. It was one voice, steady and uninterrupted, like someone reading aloud or reciting something. But I couldn't make out the words through that heavy fire door. But I could hear the cadence, rhythmic even, almost monotone. It went on for probably 3 minutes straight without any pause, which is a long time for someone to talk without stopping. Try sometime to talk for 3 uninterrupted minutes and you'll see what I mean. You need to breathe, you gotta swallow, you lose your train of thought. But this voice didn't stop. I walked over to the stairwell door and listened. The voice was coming from above, maybe a couple floors up, and it echoed down the shaft in a way that made it sound hollow and flat. I opened the door and called up, "Hello? Everything okay?" The voice stopped immediately. Dead silence. I stood there listening for about 30 seconds, but there was nothing else. I let the door close and I went back to the desk. 5 minutes later, it started again. Same voice, same cadence, and same stairwell. This time I didn't investigate. I just ignored it. When Tomas, the overnight guy, showed up around 11:15, I mentioned what happened. He listened for a second, said he didn't hear anything, and shrugged. But by then, it had stopped. I forgot about this event until it happened again about a week later. Same time roughly, and same stairwell, and it sounded like the same voice. I mentioned it to the daytime manager, and she said the stairwell was sometimes used by homeless people trying to find a warm place to sleep, and that I should call security if I suspected someone was in there. I called security that night. They walked the entire stairwell, all 12 floors, and found nobody up there. The doors on every floor were closed and locked from the stairwell side, which meant someone would have needed a room key to exit onto any floor. The only unlocked exit was the lobby door, right next to me, and no one had come through it. This went on for about 2 months. Every week or so, the voice, always around 10:30 to 11 at night, and it was always in the east stairwell, never the west. And it would be a single male voice speaking in an even rhythm that I could hear but couldn't understand. I swear the words were right at the edge of my comprehension, where you kept thinking you were about to catch a phrase and then it would slip away. I got used to it. It became background noise like the ice machine or the elevator motor. A few times I opened the door and called up and the voice would stop. One time it didn't stop. I stood there with the door open and listened, and the voice just kept going, floor after floor above me, filling the stairwell with this steady, low murmur. It was the strangest thing, because the stairwell was clearly empty. I could see up the first 3 flights from where I stood, and there was nobody on any of the landings. The voice sounded like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere, bouncing off the concrete, impossible to pinpoint which floor it originated from. I closed the door and went back to work. I asked around with the other desk staff during shift change. 2 of them had heard it before. A woman named Diana, who'd worked at the hotel for years, said she'd heard the voice at least a dozen times and had stopped caring about it. She said the east stairwell had something going on, and that she'd mentioned it to the GM once, and he'd told her it was probably sound carrying from the HVAC system through the walls. Diana did not buy that explanation and told me so, but she also said that whatever it was had not caused any real problems, so she wasn't going to lose sleep over it. The other front desk person who'd heard it was a guy named Mark, who'd only been there for a few months. He said hearing it once was enough for him, and he would no longer go near the east stairwell after 10 p.m. The last time it happened was in December. I opened the stairwell door because I'd gotten bold about it by that point, and I called up to it like I always did. The voice stopped. Then, after about 5 seconds of silence, it said something that I could actually understand. Clear as day, like the speaker was standing on the landing right above me. It said, "Come up." I closed the door. I went back to my desk. I did not go up. I don't care what was saying it or why. Nothing good has ever come from a disembodied voice in an empty stairwell asking you to come closer. I've seen enough scary movies to know that, and more importantly, I've got enough common sense. Tomas showed up about 10 minutes later, and I told him what happened. He went pale and said he'd heard the voice before too, but it had never said anything he could make out. I asked if he'd ever gone up to look for it, and he laughed, saying, "Man, I don't even like taking those stairs in the daytime." I've since moved on to different employment, but I never found out who or what was talking in that stairwell. To this day, I still hope it's some sort of acoustic trick, the way the building channeled sound from outside or from the HVAC system. But even then, acoustic tricks don't say the words perfectly, "Come up." The Follower, from Amanda Jean X. I'm a real estate photographer. I work independently, mostly taking listing photos for agents in the greater Nashville area. It's a good job if you're organized, and you don't mind being in and out of empty houses all day. For me, it's enjoyable. You get to see the inside of hundreds of homes and you start to get a real feel for the stories behind them. Every house has a vibe. Most of the time, the homeowners are out when I shoot, which is standard. You don't want people's stuff and clutter in listing photos, after all. So the house is staged and empty, and I've got an hour or so to move through the rooms and get my shots done. Also, I'm almost always alone. I have a system. I arrive, let myself in with the lockbox code, walk through once to get a feel for the light, then start shooting. I've done this hundreds of times by now without incident. I'm a 31-year-old woman, and I realize that going into empty houses alone for a living sounds risky, and you'd be right. But before what I'm about to describe, nothing had ever happened that made me feel unsafe. In the spring of 2023, I had a showing scheduled for a house in a rural area, about 40 minutes from Nashville, down past Franklin toward the Williamson County line. It was a farmhouse on about 8 acres, recently renovated, listed at $1.2 million, which in that area is a nice property, but nothing unusual. Big porch, white siding, red barn in the back, picture-perfect stuff. The listing agent was someone I'd worked with a few times, a woman named Kelly, and she gave me the lockbox code, telling me the homeowners would be away for the weekend. I drove out on a Saturday morning to shoot it. The house was gorgeous. Open floor plan, new kitchen, original hardwood floors that renovation had kept. I parked in the gravel drive, letting myself in through the lockbox, and I started working. I always begin on the ground floor and work my way up, starting with the wide shots of the main living spaces, then doing the detail shots of fixtures, countertops, and stuff like that. I'd been there about 20 minutes when I heard a car pull into the gravel drive. I looked out the front window to see this dark sedan, a Nissan Altima I think, parked behind my car. A man was sitting in the driver's seat. I figured it might be a neighbor, maybe the homeowner coming back for something. I waited for him to get out, but he didn't. Instead, he just sat in the car. After a few minutes, I went back to shooting. Eventually, I checked the window again, maybe 10 minutes later, I think, and the car was still there. The man was still in the driver's seat. I was starting to feel weird about it, so I texted the listing agent, asking if anyone else was supposed to be at the property right now. She said no, then asked me why. I told her there was someone parked in the driveway. She said it might be a curious neighbor and to just keep working. I did, but when I went upstairs to shoot the bedrooms, I could see from the second floor window that the man had finally gotten out of his car. Now he was standing in the front yard, maybe 20 feet from the porch, facing the house, his hands in his jacket pockets. He was standing there on the lawn, looking up at the house, at the windows. He was of average height, average build, wearing a dark jacket and jeans. I couldn't make out his face in detail from the second floor, but I could see that he was looking directly at the house and he wasn't moving. He stood there like a guy admiring some painting in a museum, still and attentive, except he was a stranger on someone's lawn, staring at someone else's house, with a woman alone inside that house. I stepped back from the window. My heart was going fast, that adrenaline feeling where your hands get tingly and your hearing sharpens. I stood in the upstairs hallway for a minute, trying to think clearly. Maybe he was a contractor working on renovations. Maybe he was the appraiser. He could be just a weird neighbor. I kept making excuses because the alternative was something I didn't want to think about, which was that a strange man had followed my car to a remote property and was now standing outside, waiting for something. I called the listing agent this time instead of texting. I told her a man was standing in the yard, staring at the house, and it was making me uncomfortable. She said that was definitely strange, so she would call the homeowner. I could hear in her voice that she was taking it seriously, which made me feel both better and worse at the same time. She told me to lock the doors then, and to sit tight. I went downstairs, checking the front door, locked. The back door, also locked, and I felt a tad better. That's when I heard footsteps on the front porch, slow and heavy footsteps on the wooden boards. They went from one end of the porch to the other, and stopped. I was standing in the kitchen, which didn't have a view of the porch, and I stayed there. Then the footsteps came back, slower now, stopping at the front door. The door handle turned. He tried it gently, like he was testing it. The lock held. The handle went back to its resting position. I called 911. I told them someone was trying to enter a property I was working in, and that I was alone. They said they'd send someone. The dispatcher asked me to stay on the line, so I did. The footsteps left the porch. I heard them on the gravel, going back toward the driveway. I went to a side window, watching the man walk to his car, get in, then pull out of the driveway. He drove down the road and was gone by the time the sheriff's deputy arrived about 12 minutes later. The deputy took my statement and my description of the car, a dark Nissan sedan, maybe an Altima or Sentra. Oklahoma plates, but I only caught the first 2 digits. The man was black, medium build, dark jacket, baseball cap. I couldn't give a better description than that, and the deputy said that was fine. He said it could have been someone casing the property for a burglary since the listing was public online, with the address and photos showing the house was clearly empty and recently staged. He said it could have been a lot of things. Then he told me to stop working alone in vacant houses in rural areas. And I remember thinking, yeah, that's my entire job. That's literally what I do every day. But he had a point. The listing agent called me back later that afternoon and said the homeowner didn't recognize the description of the man or the car. Nobody in the neighborhood did either, and the nearest neighbor was about a quarter mile down the road, so it wasn't like there were a lot of people to ask. Hesitantly, I finished the shoot that following Monday, but only with my boyfriend sitting in the living room the entire time, reading a book. He thought I was being dramatic until I showed him the texts between me and Kelly. Then he didn't think I was being so dramatic anymore. Kelly called me a few weeks later. I assumed it was about a new listing, but her voice was different. She said the sheriff's deputy who'd responded to my call had contacted her because they'd found a dark Nissan sedan matching the description I gave. It had been abandoned in a ditch off a county road about 12 miles from the farmhouse. She paused for a long time. I could tell there was more info and that she was deciding whether or not I should be told. Ultimately, she did tell me. She said they had found 2 duffel bags in the trunk, one containing a set of knives that appeared to be clean and unused. The other contained knives that were used, and that's all she would say about those knives. She said the deputy wanted to know if I'd be willing to come in and give a more detailed statement. I said yes. I went the next day. They didn't tell me much else. I don't know if they ever identified the owner of the car. I'm not sure if they matched anything to an open case. But I know that what was in that trunk, and the fact the man had been there when I was alone, those 2 things can't be a coincidence. I've since started carrying pepper spray on every job I go to, and I tell someone my exact schedule and address before every shoot. I also got a doorbell camera that I stick on with a mount at every property I work. Just a little portable one that connects to my phone and records anyone who approaches the door. My boyfriend says that's smart. I do too. I keep thinking about that door handle turning, and what would have happened if he'd gotten inside. The Scratching in the Walk-In, from Throwaway CBIA. Short and sweet on this one. Well, short-ish. I was a line cook at a steakhouse in Council Bluffs, Iowa, for about 2 years. The restaurant was in a building that used to be a church, then a furniture store, then sat empty for a decade before someone bought it, converting it into a restaurant in 2014. You could still see where the church stuff had been if you knew what to look for. The arch above the main dining room was the old sanctuary arch, and the wine cellar was actually a baptismal room with the pool filled in. The owner thought the history gave it character. I thought it gave it problems. Our walk-in cooler was in the basement, which was the old church basement. Cinder block walls and a concrete floor that was always a little damp no matter what the weather was doing outside. In summer, it sweated. In winter, it just felt wet. The floor drain never quite worked right, and there was always a faint smell of mildew down there that the industrial cleaner couldn't fully cover. The whole basement felt like a place that didn't want people in it, if that even makes sense. Like it was just tolerating you. Nobody liked going down there alone. The ghost thing came later, but even before that, it was just dark and cold, and the stairs were narrow, and the light switch was at the bottom instead of the top, of course. So you had to walk down 12 creepy steps in the dark before you could see anything. Bad design, in my opinion. Whoever built it clearly didn't think about the fact that someone would be going down those stairs at midnight, carrying a bus tub of steaks. I slipped on those stairs at least twice in my first month. The second time, I almost dropped a full cambro of beef tenderloin, and I seriously wondered if this job was worth my kneecaps. Now to the reason I'm writing the story. Around November of my first year, I was closing, alone in the kitchen because the other cook had already clocked out, and I needed to grab a case of burger patties from the walk-in for the next morning's prep. Just routine stuff. I went down the stairs, hit the lights, and opened the walk-in door, and while I was inside loading the case onto a sheet tray, I heard scratching on the outside of the walk-in wall. It was coming from the back wall, the one that backed up against the foundation of the building, against dirt and concrete. There was nothing back there. It was a foundation wall with solid earth on the other side. I knew that because the owner had shown me the building plans once when he was bragging about the renovation. That wall backed up against the original stone and concrete foundation of the church, and beyond that was packed dirt, and eventually the ground under the parking lot next door. The scratching was slow and irritating, like fingernails on a chalkboard, but deeper and heavier, with more weight behind it. It would go for about 5 seconds, stop, then start again in a slightly different spot, as if whatever was making the noise was moving along the wall. I grabbed my patties and got out of there fast. I told myself it was mice, maybe rats, something inside the walls. The building was old. Things like that do happen, old buildings with critters. But it kept happening, 2 or 3 times a week, always when I was the last one in the building, always from the back wall of the walk-in. And over the months, it got louder. The volume stayed below anything you'd call screaming, but the intensity increased, harder and more forceful, like whatever was making the sound was putting more effort into it. I started timing it without really meaning to, and I noticed that it usually started between midnight and 12:30. It would last for anywhere from 5 minutes to about 20. It wasn't constant. There would be bursts of scratching, then silence, then more scratching, like it was testing the wall or feeling for something. I brought it up to the other kitchen staff, getting mixed reactions. One guy said he'd heard it too, and thought it was pipes expanding and contracting. Another guy got quiet when I mentioned it, and his face looked nervous. When it was just the 2 of us, he told me flat out that the basement was messed up, and that he never went down there alone anymore. He said he'd heard the scratching before, yeah, but he'd also heard what sounded like breathing coming from behind the back wall one night. Heavy and slow, rhythmic breathing, like something big sleeping. He said he'd told the owner about it, and the owner had just blown him off. After that, he just dealt with it by going down there in pairs. He wouldn't say more than that, and I didn't want to press him anymore. He looked like talking about it was physically painful. The last time I heard it was the night I quit. I was in the walk-in alone, late, and that scratching started on the back wall like always. But this time, about 10 seconds in, there was a single hard bang on the wall from the other side. It was not a scratch anymore. It was a hit, a fist or a palm, flat against the concrete, hard enough that I felt the vibration through the wall. Then silence, followed by 3 more bangs, evenly spaced, bang, bang, bang. Then the scratching started again, faster than before, almost frantic. I walked out of the walk-in, up the stairs, out the back door, and I called the owner from my car to tell him I was done. He asked if something happened, and I told him the basement was his problem, and I would not be going back down there. He wanted to argue, but I hung up. I found another job the next week, at some barbecue place. As for the steakhouse, I requested that they mail me my last check. I wanted nothing further to do with that building. This world is a lot weirder than we give it credit for, and that seems to go double for the places where people work alone, especially regarding what people are apparently seeing in the Appalachian Mountains. That puppet-like thing watching them in the tree line. What could that be? Let me know what you think, if you have any theories, or if you've seen it yourself. Good night. Thanks for tuning into this episode of Tales from the Break Room. I've been your host, Darkness Prevails, and you can find my other podcast, Unexplained Encounters, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. You'll love it if you need more scary story narrations from yours truly. The show features stories about the unknown and horrifying, especially in the outdoors. Till next time, everyone, I've got to clock out, but I'll be back again real soon. Out in small-town rural Texas, there are old forgotten homesteads with long, often ancient pasts. When one family takes advantage of a cheap piece of land and moves out there, they discover something that was left behind and promptly remove it. It does not take long for them to realize it was there for a very important reason. This story is called The Red Circle and was sent to me anonymously. Every house has a history, and sometimes history repeats itself. The asking price should have told me everything. 40 acres and a 3-bedroom ranch house in Terrell County, Texas. For a figure I'd have expected to pay for a used SUV with cosmetic damage. I checked the title 3 times for liens, pulled the tax history, ran the parcel number through every database my work credentials could access. The property was clean. I assumed, as anyone would, that the remoteness accounted for the price. Sanderson is 2.5 hours from the nearest city that qualifies for a city, and even then the city is Odessa, which qualifies only technically. We moved in at the end of summer. The heat was the kind that makes you feel personally disliked by the sky. Renee sat in the passenger seat with her sunglasses on, not talking, which I'd learned from 11 years of marriage could mean she was angry or tired or simply finished with the day's conversation before it even started. Lily slept in her car seat, face red and damp with her mouth open, looking like a small drunk. Cody had his headphones on, watching something on the tablet. The dogs were in the back of the truck, pressed flat on the bed, ears pinned by wind. The house appeared on the horizon slowly, like the land was still deciding whether to let us see it. First the roofline, then the walls, then the scrub yard and the leaning fence posts. It looked like something a child would draw if you asked them to draw a house, and they were only being half honest about it. The proportions weren't quite right. Additions had been made to the original structure at least twice, and whoever did the work had not worried much about matching materials or maintaining the roofline. The eastern side of the house sat slightly higher than the western side. I loved it immediately, though. I know how that sounds. Renee looked at it and took her sunglasses off, then put them back on, saying, "Okay." That was the tone she used when she decided she would survive something, to tolerate it. But I had wanted land since I was a boy, sharing a wall with a family of 5 in a San Antonio apartment complex. Back then, the hallways always smelled of pine sol and cooking grease. 40 acres was more land than anyone in my family had ever touched. The size of the sky out there made my chest feel loose for the first time in years. The silence, which Renee would later call aggressive, felt to me like the first clean breath after years of breathing through a cloth. The Starlink dish went up on the roof the second week. I'd done the coverage check before we made the offer. Without it, I had nothing. My contract work required a stable connection, and my clients didn't care that I'd moved to a place where cell service arrived and departed with the mood of the atmosphere. The landline in the kitchen worked, technically, but it hummed with static when the wind blew, which was almost always. And the sound it made when you held the receiver to your ear was like someone pressing their mouth very close to a microphone and breathing. I found the line on the 6th day, while walking the perimeter of the house, looking for foundation cracks. The slab had settled unevenly. A hairline fracture ran along the southeast corner, and I'd been following it with my finger when I noticed a band of red on the ground about 40 feet out from the wall. A mineral deposit of some sort, I thought. Some oxidized stripe in the caliche. But I followed it, and it curved, and that curve went on and on, bending around the house in a rough circle. It was thick and uneven, painted directly onto the hardpan. It was red like the floor of a mechanic's garage, painted over with a safety zone. When I crouched and scratched at it with my boot heel, it came up in layers, one shade of red over another. Someone had painted this circle many times. The oldest layers had faded to the color of dried blood on a bandage. The top coat was newer, maybe 5 or 6 years old, but the sun and wind had started on it. I told Renee about it over dinner. She asked if it was something to do with septic drainage. I said probably. Then Cody asked if it was a pentagram that was never finished. "Boy, just eat your chicken," I said. Lily ignored the conversation entirely, feeding a piece of broccoli to the dog under the table. The dog accepted it without enthusiasm, which was unusual for that dog. Renee asked me to get rid of it on the second weekend. She had been walking the yard with Lily, looking for a place to put a garden box, and that line was starting to bother her. "It looks like someone was trying to keep something out," she said, then laughed, but only with her mouth. I agreed that it was ugly. I'd been planning to pressure wash the porch anyway, so I dragged the hose out, working my way around the circle over the course of one afternoon. The paint came up easily enough under the spray. The water cut through it and turned the soil dark, and the dark soil dried almost immediately in the heat, as if the ground was thirsty enough to drink it before I could finish a section. By 4 o'clock the line was gone and the ground looked clean. I felt satisfied. Being a new homeowner with control over your own property has that effect. That night, the dogs barked from 10 in the evening until nearly 3 in the morning, then stopped at the same moment, both of them mid-bark, like a recording that had been switched off. The silence after that was worrying. I lay in bed, listening to the house settle and tick. I tried to tell myself that the quality of the darkness in the room was the same as it had been every night so far. But I knew it wasn't. It was thicker that night. It had something to it I could only describe as attentive, which is not a good word to describe darkness. But that dark that night, it felt loaded or pressurized. The sky outside was clear and full of stars, and the stars looked very far away. In the morning, I was astonished. Every door in our house had been opened. Interior doors, cabinet doors, the oven and the dishwasher, the medicine cabinet in the bathroom, that little door on the front of the dryer where you clean the lint trap. Every single thing that could be opened had been opened, and everything stood wide. Renee asked if I'd done it. I asked if she had. Then we asked the kids. Cody said no, and he seemed offended that we would ask him that. Lily was eating cereal and didn't answer. Then again, she was only 4. Cereal was way more interesting than some question. We closed everything and moved on with our day. We had just uprooted our lives for a dream I'd been carrying since childhood, and closing some doors and moving on was the best option that we had to help us keep going. I think we settled on sleeping through some sort of earthquake, a small one that can open some doors and leave things ajar. Yeah, maybe it was cope. The next few nights I slept badly. I didn't have nightmares in the traditional sense. What I did have was this feeling. I would wake up at some odd hour in the night, and I'd feel like someone had just been standing beside the bed and had taken a single step backward the instant my eyes began to open. The feeling was so specific and so physical that I would lie still and listen for breathing that wasn't mine or Renee's. But I would hear nothing, even though that feeling of not being alone in our room persisted. Then Renee started to find her things moved. Her keys were in the freezer. Her phone was in the mailbox at one point at the end of our driveway, which was a 1/4 mile from our house. She found her reading glasses in Lily's toy bin, folded neatly and placed on top of a stuffed rabbit. She blamed the kids, and it kinda did make the most sense, because otherwise how do things like that wind up where they did? It was either the kids or the world's dumbest burglar. I watched her face when she said it was the kids, and I could see she didn't fully believe it. But I also could see that I think we all needed to believe it, so I didn't go against her on that. Before long, the smell started. It came in around the 2nd week. Pretty faint at the start of it, and I mean genuinely faint. I wasn't sure it was even real until I smelled it in 2 separate rooms on the same evening. I would describe it as sulfur-like, cut with something earthy and flowery, like water left at the bottom of a flower pot. A nursery school teacher I'd known as a kid kept a vase like that on her desk for an entire semester, refilling the water but never changing the flowers. And by April, the classroom had that same sour, sweet rot, organic decay, something floral underneath, neither disguising the other. That was the smell. I noticed the smell was strongest in our hallway, the one that ran from the bedrooms to the kitchen in a straight line, about 30 feet if I had to guess. During the day it was just a hallway, but at night it felt longer than it actually was. I know it sounds like a metaphor when I say it, but I'm not meaning it as a metaphor, but literally. Like when I walked from the bedroom to the kitchen at 2 a.m., the hallway seemed to contain more space than it did during the day. The walls seemed farther apart. The ceiling seemed higher. The bathroom door, which I could normally reach in 6 steps from our bedroom, took 8 or 9 steps, and I would arrive at the kitchen, winded, disoriented, unsure of how long I'd been walking. Of course, a guy like me, I had to measure it. I'm a man who works with structured data, and I measured the hallway at 2 p.m. and again at 2 a.m. with the same tape measure, and I got the same number both times, 31 feet and 4 inches. Well, I guess that number meant nothing. The hallway didn't care what the tape measure said. I knew there was no way the sizes were the same. Around the same time, I found the marks on the doors. I noticed them first on the back door, which I used every morning to let out the dogs. 4 vertical scratches in the paint, running from chest height down to the handle. They were deeper than my fingernail when I ran my finger across it. But it didn't look like an animal had done it. It almost looked like a man or person had. But who scratches their own door? I didn't think either me or Renee would do it, and the kids didn't have the strength to leave marks like that. The front door had them as well, same height and spacing, drawn down the wood with a steady, even pressure from top to bottom. The hand that made them did not vary and did not seem to tire. I checked the door in the garage. 4 scratches. The frame of the window above the kitchen sink. 4 scratches. The sill of the window in Cody's room on the outside, which I could only see by leaning out over the frame. 4 scratches, fresh enough that the curls of stripped paint still clung to the wood. Not long after that, the dogs stopped going outside. They had been reluctant since the night we washed the line, but now they flat out refused. They'd stand at the back door when I opened it, looking out at the yard with their ears flat and bodies low. When I saw their tails pressed between their legs so tightly their tails trembled, I knew something was wrong. If I stepped out and called at them, they would whine and back up instead. They slept in the kitchen, huddled so close together with each other under the table. And during the day they followed Renee from room to room, desperately seeking her attention. Those dogs had decided that they were her dogs, and Renee had never had a say in the matter. Our older dog, a shepherd mix named Dutch, developed a habit of staring at the hallway from the kitchen threshold. He would sit there for hours with his head slightly lowered, watching the corridor, and if anyone walked through the hallway, he would track them with his eyes. I could see the fur along his spine lift and settle and lift again. What was he looking for, I wondered. One night during the second week, I got up to get some water. The hallway was doing that thing again, where it seemed to be stretched out. I walked it slowly. My legs felt stiff, and the air in the corridor had that quality again of thickness and not being alone. And unsurprisingly, the smell was back. I was passing Cody's door when I heard something outside the house, a sound that I initially processed as the wind. You see, the wind is always blowing out there, so you learn to subtract it from everything else you hear. But this sound had a regularity to it that wind doesn't have, a sort of rhythm. Something was circling the house. I could hear it in the gravel and scrub on the north side, a soft crunching evenly paced. Then it moved to the east side. The sound continued at the same tempo, then the south, and then the west, then the north again, a full circuit. Whatever was making the sound was walking the perimeter of the house in a circle, which happened to match the path where the red line used to be. I stood frozen in the hallway, listening to it complete 3 circuits. On the 3rd circuit, it stopped on the western side, directly outside the wall of Lily's bedroom. There was silence then, for perhaps 30 seconds. Then a low, resonant hum, nearly below the range of hearing, but I could feel it slowly traveling through my bones. It stopped, and the wind was just the wind again. I went back to bed, confused. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling, feeling exhausted inside and out. I forced myself to sleep before I could think too much about things. Lily began to talk to someone around the 3rd week. I heard it through the wall of her bedroom. She would talk and pause as if waiting for someone to reply, then talk again, Here and there would be little laughs and short answers. I went in her room, asking her who she was talking to. "The sad man," she said. She was sitting on her bed with a crayon in one hand and a coloring book open to a page of farm animals. She hadn't colored inside any of the lines. "Where's the sad man, sweetheart?" "He's in the wall. He says he used to live here and he misses somebody." "Okay, what else does he say?" "Well, he says you washed away his work and that it was important." She sounded like she was scolding me, then went right back to coloring, filling in a horse with a blue crayon. She was 4 and the conversation was over for her. No amount of standing in the doorway was going to reopen that conversation. I put my hand on the frame, and I felt the wood. It just felt like wood, but hearing her say what she said was yet another thing that was making this house feel more alive. The wall she'd pointed at was the western wall. It faced the yard, and beyond the yard, the shed. Now, I should tell you about the shed. It sat around 80 yards from the house, closer to the western fence line. It was built from cinder blocks with a corrugated metal roof. It didn't have any windows. The door was a heavy wooden slab, a single thick piece that did not match anything you'd buy at a hardware store. And a padlock held it shut, rusted to the color and texture of a scab that had been picked at and reformed many times. I told my kids to stay away from that thing. The structure looked unsound, and that was true. But over time, it was also true that the shed was making me feel uneasy, just like the rest of the house. Speaking of the house, it showed its age honestly. Cracked caulk, sun-bleached paint, wasp nests everywhere, and sand tended to drift into every seam and corner. That desert had been weathering the house for 60 years. The house clearly bore those wounds, but the shed did not. The roof wasn't rusted through, and the cinder blocks were not crumbling. The mortar between them looked almost recent, in fact. It sat out there in the scrub, kept and tended to by no one I could see, and I had not gone inside it because I had not wanted to. I was busy with the house, my family, my Starlink, and my contracts. I cut the padlock with bolt cutters on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after we moved in, 2 days after Lily started talking to the wall, or rather the sad man. The lock resisted and then gave with a brittle crack, like breaking a stick of chalk. The door swung inward on hinges that moved a little too smoothly. Inside, there was a single room, maybe 10 by 12 feet, with a concrete floor swept so clean that the broom marks were still visible in the dust, parallel lines running corner to corner. A wooden table was pushed against the back wall, and the surface was covered in ring marks from mugs and cans, and what looked like candle wax, layered and scraped and relayered over years. The air inside was cool and still, which made no sense for a cinder block box in the West Texas sun. It should have been a baking oven in there. Instead, the air had a damp chill to it, like a cellar would, and the coolness seemed to rise from beneath the floor. On the table and on shelves made from planks and cinder blocks, I found what the previous owner had left behind: an old Coleman lantern with a cracked mantle. There was also a plastic jug, empty, that still smelled faintly of kerosene. There were several mason jars filled with a coarse white substance that I later determined was salt. There was also a coffee can packed with dried sage, brittle and gray. Then I found the notebooks. His name was Harlan Cull. The name had been written inside the cover of the first notebook, where he wrote it in block letters alongside a date: September 2004. There were maybe a dozen of these notebooks, the cheap composition kind with the marbled black and white covers. They reminded me of the ones I'd use in middle school for vocabulary lists. They were filled front to back in handwriting that began small and controlled, but progressively fell apart over what I estimated to be several years of entries. I read through the notebooks over the course of 3 evenings, sitting at the kitchen table after the kids were in bed, while Renee watched TV in the living room. the hallway between us doing its trick of feeling stretched. What I pieced together from that information was this. Harlan moved to the property after his wife died. He chose the isolation. But something started to happen almost right away, and his early entries described it. Doors open in the morning, objects displaced, that smell in the hallway, and sounds at night, specifically what he called a breathing in the walls, which he initially thought was pipes or wind. The entries changed over the first year. The precise and careful handwriting eroded. He began repeating the same observations, writing them down again and again, as if he was trying desperately not to forget, or to remind himself. He tried salt, then sage, then a priest from Alpine who came once, performed something, and never returned. Harlan wrote about calling the diocese 3 times afterward, but he was told that the priest was unavailable. He tried sealing the doors with weather stripping, and he tried sleeping in the shed at times. One time he tried to leave. He drove 40 miles toward Fort Stockton before turning around because, and I quote, "It's worse to know it's here and not be watching it." Ugh, that line gave me chills. Then he found the books. They were still on the shelves when I opened the shed. 3 of them, cheaply printed and dense, perfectly bound, like small academic press-run books. The titles seemed to be in Latin and English, and the publishers were names I'd never seen before and could not find when I searched for them later. One of them had a chapter marked with a strip of electrical tape, and that chapter described a category of entity that attached to grief. That entity does not arrive, the book said. It accretes. It builds itself from the particular energy of a person who has lost someone they loved and cannot, in some fundamental interior place, release them. The grief becomes material. It accumulates, slowly, and eventually reaches a kind of critical mass. That's when it becomes conscious, and that's when it starts to want things. It wants doors, it wants a body, it wants to dissolve the boundaries between spaces, between inside and outside, between the living and the dead, and whatever else there might be. The line was Harlan's answer. In one of the later notebooks, he described finding the instructions in one of the books. The language he used was a declared perimeter, which he described as a boundary maintained by active human intention. Paint it on the ground, renew it regularly, walk it daily, and keep it watched. The entity could not cross it as long as someone was choosing to enforce it. The moment attention lapsed, the moment the paint faded and no one repainted it, that boundary became abstract, and abstract boundaries meant nothing to that thing in the walls. Harlan maintained the line for what I calculated to be 15 years, from approximately 2004 to his death in 2019. His notebooks were filled with the maintenance of that line, about which sections faded the fastest and how weather affected coverage. He even described what happened the one time he let a section go thin. A single entry from November 2014 that read, "The south side, rain washed the paint. It got through. I will not let that happen again." There were no details about what "got through" actually meant, and that lack of detail was what really troubled me, because I kept thinking about what that could mean. Harlan died in the house, sitting in a kitchen chair facing the front door. I found his obituary in the online archive of a paper I'd never heard of. 3 sentences saying, "Longtime resident, no surviving family, private services." Driven entirely by curiosity, I began to pull some data. My work credentials gave me access to title search databases. I ran the parcel number and pulled the chain of ownership. The property had changed hands 6 times since 1979. Average stay, 3 to 4 years. One family lasted just 8 months. I found a gap between 1981 and 1986, during which the county held the title, and a note in the digital record said, "Structure condemned," though no condemnation report was attached, and the house had clearly been reoccupied after that. The pattern looked, to someone like me, like a recurring error in a system. The same input producing the same failed output, over and over, but no one ever fixing it. In a scan of a county assessor's file, I found a photograph. It was a Polaroid, uploaded at low resolution, which depicted the house taken from a distance. The image was poor, but I could see the red line on the ground, faded and splotchy, but unmistakably the same circle. The metadata on the scan said the original photo was dated 1983 on the back, so the line had been there 20 years before Harlan Cole even arrived. Harlan never created the first line. He had just found it, just as I had found it. But he recognized it for what it was, or learned what it was, and he restored it, took care of it, until he died in a kitchen chair facing the front door. I realized that was the only door he could watch from that position. That man had probably been sitting there watching for 15 years. Over those days that I read all of this, I couldn't believe it. I believed that Harlan Cole was a lonely man who had lost his wife, so he came to the desert and slowly disassembled in the heat and the solitude. The notebooks were some sort of record of a mind turning in on itself, struggling to cope with trauma and loneliness, building a mythology around the ordinary creaks and smells of an old house. Despite how creepy these books and notebooks were, this is what I believed. Until the night I stopped in the hallway outside Lily's room at 2:47 a.m., and I once again heard her talking. Her half of the conversation was simple. Those short sentences that 4-year-olds do. Okay. Why? That's silly. And then she laughed, a real good laugh. But after she was done laughing, I heard it, through the wall. A sound at the lowest edge of my hearing, more vibration than voice. There was someone in there with my daughter. I opened the door. Lily was sitting up in bed, facing the western wall, the one she said the sad man was in. She turned to look at me, and her face did something. For perhaps half a second she looked at me with an expression that did not belong to my daughter. She looked older than she actually was, and angry, like I'd interrupted something important. A flicker of irritation and authority which could not come from my child. It crossed her features and was gone. In the same suddenness, she was Lily again, small and sleepy. She said to me, "Daddy, I was talking." Then she lay back down and closed her eyes. I stood in the doorway and put my hand on the western wall. It was warm. The rest of the house was cool. The AC had been running all evening, and the hallway air had that dry, conditioned chill to it. But that wall was warm. Something inside that wall was giving off its own heat. Something alive and resting just behind the sheetrock where my daughter slept every night. I would be repainting the line the next morning. I drove to Fort Stockton, as Sanderson doesn't have a hardware store. An hour each way. I bought 4 cans of red exterior paint, the cheapest kind. I mean, from what I saw, Harlan also used cheap paint, and I wasn't about to improve upon the methods of a man who kept this thing contained for 15 years. I started at the point on the north side where I could still see the faintest trace of the old line, a discoloration of the caliche that was invisible unless you knew it was there. I painted the full circle in one afternoon. The paint went down easily enough, soaking into the ground, and I worked steadily. My wife probably saw me bent at the waist with a brush and the sun bearing down on my neck. When I was finished, I stood at the edge of the circle and looked back at the house, which now sat once more within a red perimeter, and I felt relief, like a problem had been solved, sort of like I dodged a bullet. That night, every door in the house stayed closed. The dogs went outside for the first time in a week and lay in the yard, sleeping. The hallway was 31 feet and 4 inches long and actually felt that way all day long. and I was able to sleep through the night for the first time since we'd arrived. Nothing woke me up out of nowhere. I woke instead to the ordinary heat of a Texas morning, and the quietness and peace outside was the good kind. The house finally felt like just a house. This lasted 10 days. I checked that line every morning. I walked the full perimeter as Harlan had, looking for cracks, maybe some fading, or places where wind-blown sand was beginning to cover the paint. I found some, and when I did, I would touch them up. The desert weathers down everything. The wind will file paint down grain by grain, and the sun will bleach it, and the sand will just cover it. Given enough time, it would erase this whole circle, in some way. And whatever lay beyond the line, well, I was sure it had all the time in the world. I began to think of the maintenance, something I had not planned for to live out here. This would from now on require my daily attention, or it would fail again, like it was some roof or fence needing patched. But as stressful as it sounded, I soon realized I didn't mind the work. The mornings were nice. I'd always been a morning person. The light came in gold from the east, and the air was cool still before being warmed up by the sun, and it smelled of creosote and dust. I would walk the circle with my brush and can, and I felt, for about half an hour each day, important and satisfied. It kind of reminded me of my database work, building a clean schema. The line was a kind of query. It asked the desert a question every day, and the answer so far was the right one. Again, during those 10 days, the house felt like a normal house. Even that smell had gone. I found Renee humming while cooking. The dogs were now rolling around in the dirt outside, playing. Lily was playing with her toys alone or talking to herself, usually narrating her own actions in third person, not talking to some other entity. That voice in the wall was absent. Cody found me on the line on a Saturday morning. I was on the western side with a brush and a can of paint, as usual, touching up a section that had faded just slightly. I looked up, and he was standing about 10 feet away from me. He was watching me awkwardly. I could tell he'd been there a while. "Why are you painting a circle around the house?" he asked. I started to say something about marking underground utilities or something. The words were halfway up my throat when Cody cut me off. "I saw something standing out here last night." I set the brush across the top of the paint can. "Where did you see it?" He pointed past the line, into the scrub, toward the fence line and the miles of nothing beyond it. "About there, past the red. It was standing still." "Oh, it's nothing, son, just some animal." "It was the size of a person, but it didn't look like a person." He paused, squinting. "The arms were in the wrong spots, or the legs were. It was hard to tell because it was pretty far away. It was standing up, but it looked like it didn't know how to stand up yet. And its head was on sideways. It kept moving its fingers, all of them really fast, the whole time I watched." I stared at him, goosebumps on the back of my neck. He stared back and seemed so calm, in spite of what he saw. "Son, why didn't you wake us up?" "'Cause it was outside the red line. I could tell it couldn't come past it. And I didn't open the window," he said, as if trying to avoid getting in trouble if he had. But that was beyond my concern at this point. I decided to tell him a version of the truth. I told him the previous owner believed something lived on the property, and that the line was how he kept it back. I said I wasn't sure I believed it yet, but the line seemed to help. I then looked him in the eye and told him I needed him to keep his window closed at night and to stay inside the circle. He nodded. Then he said something that gave me a chill. "Dad, Lily isn't talking to the man who lived here before us. She's talking to that thing that lived here with him." He then went back inside. I knelt in the dirt beside my half-painted section and listened to the wind. Renee told me we were leaving on a Wednesday evening after the kids were in bed. She'd been patient, she explained, for longer than I deserved. She tolerated the smell, the moved objects, the dog's behavior, and my increasing preoccupation with the shed and the notebooks and the perimeter. And despite everything getting better, she'd been watching me go outside at 3 a.m. to touch up a section of the line by torchlight, and she was not happy with that. She'd been standing in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, watching me kneel in the dirt with a paintbrush and a can of Rust-Oleum. She told me this land had changed me, was turning me into something that wasn't her husband. "We're going to Jin's," she said. Jin was her sister in Odessa. "I'm packing tomorrow." "Renee, this is not what I signed up for, David. You're out there painting the ground at 3 a.m. You spend every evening in that shed reading the diaries of a dead man. I saw the kids talking to the freaking walls. I don't care if it's real or if you've lost your mind, because either way, the kids and I are leaving tomorrow, and you're welcome to join us." I tried to explain. I began to tell her about the notebooks and the line, and what happens if the paint fades. She held up her hand, and I went quiet. She didn't want an explanation, at least not one that sounded insane. She wanted a husband, a normal family, and a normal house, and she was completely justified to want that. She was right, but to me at the time, maintaining that line and choosing family were one and the same. In my head, I took a step back and looked at it. I couldn't argue with how insane I looked, and part of me wanted to leave as well. I wanted to put the house and the shed and the line in the rearview mirror and drive to Odessa to sleep with my wife in Jin's guest room and drink some coffee in a kitchen that smelled like normal kitchen. But another, newer part of me felt like I couldn't do that I had a responsibility to stay here and maintain the red line. If we left, no one would maintain it. I helped her pack. I packed boxes and loaded the truck, and I told myself we would figure it out from Odessa. Maybe we'd sell the place and take the loss. Maybe someone else would find the notebooks and understand. I knew none of this was true, even while I was thinking it, but I kept packing anyway. We would be leaving in the morning, as she had said. That night, I did a final check of the line at sunset. I walked the perimeter, north side fine, east side fine, south side fine. But then I came to the western section. It was completely gone. The paint had been removed from the ground, scraped away in long strips, and I could see the marks in the dirt where something had dragged across the surface. 4 lines, like the scratches on the doors I found before. I repainted it in the dark. I worked with a torch wedged under my chin and the brush shaking in my hand. I laid down the paint, wet and thick. I could feel something watching me the entire time, from outside the circle, from within the scrub. I didn't see it, but I wasn't trying to find it. But it felt like the darkness out past the scrub had pulled into one spot and taken form. Whatever that feeling was coming from, it was only about 15 feet away. It was not moving and not making a sound. It was like a darkness was at the boundary of the new paint, pressing its face into it like glass. I finished and carefully backed toward the house. That gathered darkness stayed where it was. Inside, Renee was holding Lily in the kitchen. The girl had woke up, talking again, louder than usual. Renee had gone in to check on her, only to hear the other half of the conversation through the wall. The voice that came from within the wall. She couldn't make out the words. She described it as a hum, muffled and distant, but certainly words. She was white. Her hands were trembling. She held Lily against her chest, and Lily was now sleeping, completely asleep, breathing steadily. Thank God for the little things. Renee looked at me and said nothing, but she appeared frightened. I think that was the point where she realized her husband had not lost his mind. I sat down across from her at the kitchen table. The clock on the stove read 11:42 p.m. The house ticked and settled around us, and that red line outside, freshly painted, held. We left at dawn. The packing was already done. I loaded the last boxes while Renee strapped the kids into the truck, and the dogs jumped into the bed, immediately pressing themselves flat. Even they looked excited to leave. The sun was just clearing the eastern hills, and the thin light hit the house, making it look so deceptively ordinary, just like it looked the first day. But that fresh red circle now looked insane, which it definitely was. I walked back to the front door, and I stood still for a second before pulling it shut. The house sounded quiet. The hallway was visible and empty where I stood, and it ran straight back to the kitchen. Just a hallway, that 31-foot and 4-inch hallway, drywall and carpet. It was almost beautiful. As I said, I pulled the door closed. I locked it, and I went back to my vehicle with my family, and we drove. Renee sat in the passenger seat with her sunglasses on, not talking, just like she had come in when we first arrived. Cody had his headphones on and Lily was still sleeping. The road out of Sanderson goes north through nothing for a long time, before it meets anything you might call civilization. I watched the house in the rearview mirror, getting smaller, shrinking, including the shed behind it, and from there I could not see the red line anymore. Those 40 acres of land I'd wanted since I was a boy in San Antonio, I was leaving it all behind. We went to Jen's in Odessa. She gave us the guest room and the pull-out couch in the den, not asking too many questions. Jen was the kind of person that knows people sometimes show up, and the questions and answers come later. I had my personal laptop. I had contracts to finish. I sat at Jen's dining table and wrote queries and built database schemas, occasionally answering emails. And at night, I lay in the guest bed next to Renee, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the line, wondering whether the paint was still holding, or if the wind had started to cover it with sand again. 3 weeks passed by. The kids were settling in. Cody started a new school and didn't complain. That boy, I swear, he deals with things on his own and so quietly. He comes to his own conclusions when he's ready. Lily played with Jen's cat and did not mention the sad man, and slept through every night. The color came back to Renee's face again before long. She went back to her old self, cooking full meals instead of heating cans. She and Jen sat on the back patio in the evenings, drinking wine and talking about their mother or their jobs. I sat back and watched my family, happy that it was over and that my obsession with the line was slowly fading. Whatever had been in that house, it was not here. Then I got the notification. My Starlink account sent me an alert that the dish was still drawing power. This was expected. We had left in a hurry, and I hadn't disconnected a thing. But the alert prompted me to check the system status remotely, and the system status showed that my work laptop, which I'd left on the desk in the room I'd been using as an office, was still connected and still awake. I'd left it open and I'd left it on the charger. The Starlink was still feeding it a connection. I remoted in from Jen's dining table at 11 o'clock. Everyone else was in bed. The connection was slow but consistent. The laptop screen appeared on my monitor, that familiar desktop and icons. I was able to view the webcam from there, so I did. The room around the laptop was dark. The webcam showed the desk, the chair, the wall behind it. I could see the edge of the doorway to the hall. The house looked the same. I angled the view using the remote desktop cursor, tilting the laptop screen incrementally, trying to get a wider picture. I could see more of the room. The bookshelf, the window, dark. The ceiling fan, which was motionless. A coffee mug I'd apparently left on the desk was still there, undisturbed. My office chair pushed back from the desk at the angle I'd left it. These ordinary things comforted me for about 2 seconds until I saw the doors. Every door I could see was open. The closet in the office, the door to the hallway, and through the hallway door, I could see the bathroom door on the far side also open, and beyond it, the dark rectangle of the linen closet, gaping. The house had peeled itself open again, every cavity exposed, every threshold breached. The hallway was visible through the doorway, a strip of deeper dark beyond the room's darkness. And at the far end of the hallway, just at the edge of what the webcam's tiny lens could resolve. I saw a shape. It was standing in the hallway. It was the approximate size and height of a man, and he was facing the camera, facing the room. It was standing perfectly still, just the way Cody had described. The image resolution was very low and dark, and I could not see much detail. I could see enough to know that the shape did have a head, and that the head was tilted slightly. It could have been a coat on a hook, or a shadow thrown by the hall light filtering through a window from outside. It could have been pareidolia, the brain's compulsion to find faces and bodies in random visual noise. I kept watching it, waiting for something to happen. And for some time, nothing did. But then, suddenly, the shape moved. It shifted its weight, perhaps adjusting its posture. It leaned forward by some small amount. It was looking at the camera now with what I understood, and a part of my brain was recognition. It knew. It knew I was looking at it through the laptop webcam. I shut the laptop hard enough to nearly break the screen, and I kept both hands pressed on it, like something might burst open from within it at any second. I sat at Jen's dining table in the lamplight, looking around at random things. It sort of grounded me, like when you're a kid and your parents let you watch a scary movie, but they have to turn on cartoons afterward. Jen's normal house kept me sane in that moment. From the din, though, through 2 walls and a closed door, I heard Lily's voice. She was on the pull-out couch. She had been asleep for 3 hours until now, because she was talking to someone. Her voice was quiet, but she sounded as if she was responding to someone's words. I heard a small laugh, followed by an, "Okay?" I sat there listening, and the longer it went on, the more I began to tremble. I put my hands flat on the table, staring at the wood. That red, painted circle was calling me now. I felt I had to go back, that I had to drive back to Sanderson, open that shed, read the notebooks again, and ultimately repaint the line, that I would need to repaint it every single morning until the day I died. Then Lily's voice went quiet, and I watched Renee come out of the room Lily was in. I sighed. I had no idea she'd been in there. "You okay?" she asked. I stood up and hugged her so deeply, she was taken aback. "I'm fine." I went to bed with my wife then, and the only thing left on my mind was maybe moving out of Texas for good. Actually, maybe Renee should have the final say this time in where we go next. Haunted houses are scary because sometimes if you stay in them too long, it's not the house that remains haunted, but you and your family end up haunted, no matter where you go next. So be careful whenever you change zip codes. Don't find yourself somewhere with an extra occupant. Good night. Thank you all so much for tuning into this episode of Unexplained Encounters. I've been your host, Darkness Prevails. Leave Unexplained Encounters a follow and rating on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. And while you're there, you can find my other podcast if you're in the mood for more scary stories narrated by me. It's called Tales from the Break Room, and it features scary stories that are work-related. By the way, you can read or share your own scary stories over at darkstories.org. Get some EerieCast merch at eeriecast.store. And find me on YouTube at Darkness Prevails. Till next time, everyone, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one. This episode is brought to you by Eerie.fm, the best way to listen to this show and all of my narrations. For $8 a month, you can become a premium member and listen to hours of exclusive narrations from me that you can't find anywhere else. Narrations like Dogwood, a horror novel audiobook with over 6 hours of terrifying Georgia wilderness and Southern Gothic noir. Just go to EERIE.fm to listen now. That's Eerie.fm. the home of horror audio. The Skinwalker returns in today's extremely unsettling story, sent in by someone named Gabario Cart, a story titled, "The Government is Covering Up Skinwalkers." In this story, a man who is a contracted hunter on BLM land stumbles upon a disturbing encounter that leaves him changed forever. But he's not the only one who knows the truth. Don't be the one who cries, Skinwalker. I never thought I'd be a whistleblower, especially reaching out to a podcast of all places to blow that whistle, so to speak. And yet, here I am. I appreciate you taking the time to review this. I've got no idea if this will reach any ears. I've used a pen name for this story to remain anonymous, and none of the real names will match up. Most folks don't actually believe in skinwalkers. That's just a kid's bedtime story or a viral topic on the internet that has no basis in the real world. Those people are lucky, because they can sleep pretty well at night. There's also a good chunk of folks who refuse to speak of it, because they know how very real it is. And while I understand that sentiment, would you not feel duty-bound to report a serial killer in the woods, a kidnapper in our parks, especially if you witnessed it firsthand? I don't want to come off sounding crazy, but I pretty much have no other choice. What I'm about to tell you is the craziest and most mind-altering experience, or rather series of events, of my life. A person has likely never gone from ghosts and monsters are fake Hollywood drivel to, oh yeah, them suckers are real, faster than this guy. So, I've got a dream job, especially for the dudes out there. I hunt for a living, and I don't mean living off of elk bone stew in some 200 square foot cabin in the middle of nowhere. I'm no hermit. I'm actually contracted by the government, specifically the BLM, which stands for Bureau of Land Management. They pay me to basically live in the woods for weeks at a time, sometimes even months, hunting or trapping whichever animal population they find problematic. They've got dozens of bunkhouses and field stations in the land I operated in, some basically just little trailers on cinder blocks. But when you're being paid to sleep there and do your favorite thing in the world, there's not really much room to complain. This was back in the 90s. I dropped out of college my first year. I'd been going for a degree in childhood education. Funny, huh? And I moved back in with my mom looking for work. I looked for the basic starter stuff at first, like dishwashing for local restaurants, or maybe trying not to die of heat stroke at a metal factory. From a high school friend, I learned something interesting. We often talk about things at night, and the conversation moved on to which job would you take even if it paid basically nothing. And I had replied that I wished I could live in the woods and hunt for a living. Then he told me that is actually a thing. The government actually hires folks to cull animal populations on BLM land. But getting a contract like that is extremely difficult. My mind was made up right there, though, because up to that point I had no idea I could even do that. I thought forest work started and ended at the guy in funny pants and wide-brimmed hat nagging Yogi Bear about harassing campers. So I started to look into it. This was back when AOL still ruled the world, and finding niche government job postings meant wading through dead links and PDFs that crashed Internet Explorer. I printed out everything I could find about wildlife management positions, and I read through them at the kitchen table, while my mom watched Wheel of Fortune in the living room. Most of the listings were full-time biologist jobs that needed a master's degree, which obviously wasn't going to happen for me. Buried under all that, there was a category for short-term wildlife services contractors. Those requirements were way more achievable. You needed a hunter education certificate, which I already had from when I was 12. They wanted a clean background check. They also wanted proof of marksmanship that they verified at a regional office, plus a sit-down with 2 field supervisors, who basically wanted to make sure you're just not a lunatic. It took me almost 8 months to actually land my first contract. I drove down to the Salt Lake City regional office in my mom's '88 Buick that overheated if you idled for too long. The 2 supervisors asked me a bunch of questions about field experience and ethics. They wanted to know what I'd do if I encountered a wounded animal that wasn't on my contract list. The more important part of the interview was just whether I came across as a reasonable and steady person. They don't want someone flaky or some adrenaline junkie alone with a rifle for 2 months at a stretch. 2 weeks later, I got a letter offering me a 30-day contract on the Wasatch Front to help control mule deer in an area where they were eating up private alfalfa fields adjacent to public land. The pay was not amazing, but it covered my expenses, and I would get to live in a little Forest Service cabin that was nicer than my bedroom at my mom's house. That contract went smooth as butter. I came in under quota, kept clean logs, and made friends with a local game warden who'd swing by every few days to check in. His name was Cal, and he ended up being the guy who recommended me for several of my contracts. After that, the work just kept coming. I did a feral hog cull down in San Juan County. Later, I helped run a coyote contract up near the Idaho border. By '94, I'd built up enough of a reputation. I was getting offered some of the longer assignments, the ones that scared off the newer guys, because they meant being out in the brush for 60 or 90 days at a time with minimal contact. And that's how I ended up taking more and more work in the Uintah Basin. The Uintah Basin sits in the northeastern corner of Utah. It's a huge stretch of high desert right along the south slope of the Uintah Mountains. The Ute Reservation takes up a massive portion of it. There's farming and ranching country out there, plus oil and gas operations that were just starting to ramp up back then when I was working there. Off the highway, it's mostly a whole lot of nothing. I liked it out there. The sky goes on forever, and the air smells like sage and wood smoke. You can drive for an hour on those access roads and pass maybe 3 other vehicles. For a guy who wanted nothing more than to be left alone with his rifle and his coffee, it was paradise. The locals were polite, mostly, though some of them gave me the side-eye when they figured out I was a contracted culler. There's a particular kind of look you get from old ranchers who think the BLM is just one short step removed from communism. The way I'd usually get to know people in this line of work was through what we called crossover. The land out there is managed by a patchwork of agencies. BLM has the bulk of it. Forest Service handles the higher timber tracts. The state runs DWR with their own wardens, while the tribe manages reservation land separately with their own game wardens. Beyond all the agencies, you've also got oil surveyors and cattle leasers showing up on the same access roads. Everybody overlaps eventually. Whenever I rolled into a new area, the first thing I'd do was check in at the field station, meeting whoever was running the show. Then, over the next few weeks, I'd inevitably bump into that same handful of guys at the gas station outside Vernal, or out on the access roads themselves. We'd nod, eventually we'd talk, and after a contract or two, you'd consider some of them friends. The Forest Service guys especially were always happy to have somebody new to share a beer with after dark, since they were stuck in those bunkhouses for weeks at a time, the same as me. There were 3 guys specifically I got tight with during my Uintah Basin years. There was Wes, a Forest Service maintenance worker who'd been doing the job since the late 70s. And he was the one that told us the most stories around the fire pit. Ben was about my age and worked for the state DWR doing wildlife surveys. He played skeptic to anything Wes brought up, and he would do so loudly. Then there was an older fellow named Henry, who I think was actually retired from BLM, but kept getting pulled back in for consulting work because he knew the backcountry better than the maps did. Henry was the quiet one of the bunch. He'd listen and nod, and only occasionally drop something into the conversation, but it would usually make you put your beer down on the table real careful-like. Now, Wes was the one who said that word to me. We were sitting on the steps of a Forest Service cabin somewhere south of Roosevelt, drinking warm cans of Coors because the cooler had run out of ice 3 days earlier. The sun had just dropped behind the ridge, and the sky was a deep blue, which meant the stars would soon be out. I was about 3 weeks into a contract, feeling pretty good about everything. I made some offhand comment about how the silence out there could play tricks on a man, that I'd been hearing what sounded like a woman crying off in the trees the night before, but I had told myself it was a fox or maybe a mountain lion making its weird calls. Wes's face got real serious. Where exactly were you camped?" he asked. I told him. He made a face I didn't really understand at the time. then drank some of his beer and looked out at the trees. "You might want to camp somewhere else for the rest of this contract." "Why's that?" He drank even more of his beer before answering. "Some of the locals call that ridge a Skinwalker Ridge. They don't go up there at night. Even the hunters won't." I laughed, genuinely. I thought he was messing with the new guy, doing the whole rural ghost story bit to scare the city slicker. "Wes, I grew up hunting. Pretty sure I can tell the difference between a fox and some witch." He didn't laugh back. But of course he did take another bigger drink. "Suit yourself, but if you hear that crying again, don't go looking for it." The way he said that scrubbed the smile right off my face. He sat there with his eyes on the trees, not cracking a grin, and not taking back his quote-unquote joke. I changed the subject, and we ended up talking about fishing for an hour. Afterwards, I went to bed in that cabin with a weird feeling in my chest, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't double-check the door to make sure it was locked. The next morning, I told myself Wes had been pulling my leg, that he was just being colorful, but the doubt had been planted. Over the next few weeks, I began to pick up on little things. There was this waitress at a diner outside Vernal, who, when I mentioned I was working a contract up in a particular area, glanced at the window and changed my coffee order without comment. There was a guy at the hardware store in Duchesne who clocked the BLM patch on my hat. "You been seeing anything weird out there?" he asked. "What do you mean?" "Oh, you know what I mean." That's all I got. He rang me up without saying another word. The guys who ran the gas station near the Bottle Hollow turnoff would close a half hour earlier than the sign said and lock the door behind themselves so fast you'd think they were being chased. It was nothing concrete, nothing you could really point to in any one moment, but you start to notice when an entire region gets quiet at sundown. Ben, the DWR guy, never wanted to talk about any of it. He'd roll his eyes when Wes brought it up. He'd say it was a bunch of inbred nonsense from people who didn't have cable television, and he'd say it loud and clear every single time. I noticed, though, that Ben never volunteered to take the night surveys when those came up on the rotation. He'd swap with anyone, even pulling weekend shifts, just to keep his hours in the daylight. I even asked him about it. He just said he liked seeing what he was counting, but I don't think that was the whole story, not after knowing what I know now. Henry was different. Henry didn't deny a thing. But he wouldn't just give up the information either. You had to ask him and be clear about it. Even then, he'd turn the question around on you and want to know why you were asking, what you'd seen, what you've heard, before he'd give you a straight answer. I always got the impression he was deciding whether you could handle his answer. It took me about 2 months of running into Henry at the field station coffee pot before he finally told me a story of his own. We were both stuck inside one afternoon, waiting out a thunderstorm that had blown in fast from the west. He was sitting at the little fold-out table cleaning a knife. I was reading a paperback novel I'd already read twice. After a stretch of nothing but rain on our roof, he spoke up. "You ever hear the story about that survey crew up on Diamond Mountain in '78? "Can't say that I have, Henry." "There were 4 of them. Forest Service contractors doing a timber assessment. 2 grad students working alongside 2 professional surveyors. They were running a logging road that doesn't even exist on any current map. Got rained out about 10 days into the assignment, and ended up bunking in a Forest Service cabin, older than any of them. 4 went in, only 3 came back. The 4th was a kid named Caleb, 22 years old, out of Logan. A decent surveyor who'd done 2 seasons already." I heard a scraping sound and looked over at Henry. He had stopped what he was doing to test the edge of his knife on his thumbnail. Kinda grossed me out. Always hated sounds like that. "Now, here's the part nobody at the agency wanted in the report. The other 3 didn't lose track of Caleb during the day. He didn't wander off into the woods, didn't fall down some ravine. They were sleeping in the cabin and they all heard him get up around 3 a.m. They heard the door open and shut, and they heard him walk off into the trees. They figured he was going to take a leak, so they went back to sleep. When they woke up at dawn, his bunk was empty. The rifle he'd brought was still leaning against the wall by the door, but his boots were gone. Gotta say, that's kinda creepy. Did they ever find him? Well, they found his boots. Another scrape, scrape, scrape. Yikes. Set neatly side by side on a flat rock in the middle of a clearing, about a quarter-mile up the ridge from the cabin. Looked like somebody had taken them off and placed them right there. The ground around that rock was soft from the rain, but somehow there were no footprints leading up to it or away from it. No sign of how Caleb or anyone else got there or away. The boots were just sitting there. So what did the official report say? Well, it said Caleb probably got disoriented in the storm and walked off a ledge somewhere they couldn't access. Search and rescue ran the area for a week and didn't find nothing else. The family eventually got a death certificate, and the agency had to move on. He set that knife down on the table. The part that always bothered me is that those boots had laces on them. They were tied. Whoever set them on that rock had to have untied them, taken them off, then tied them back up before placing them down. I thought about that for a moment. The rain had let up and I could hear water dripping off the eaves of the cabin in a slow, tired rhythm. Do you think it was a person? I asked. Maybe some psychopath out in the woods. He raised an eyebrow and started to think. You want the answer that's gonna let you sleep tonight? He said. Or the one I actually believe? Well, Henry never gave me the comfortable answer. Give me the one you actually believe, I said. He set the knife down again, and he looked at the table while he talked, not at me. Whatever set those boots on that rock wasn't a man, wasn't anything human at all, but it knew enough about us to tie the laces back up before it put them down. How's that worse than a person doing it? Because a person doing it is a person doing it. You can hunt a person down. A person leaves prints, gets tired, sleeps somewhere eventually. Whatever did this didn't leave prints in wet ground a child could have tracked through. It didn't have to tie those laces, but it did. Caleb's family was never gonna see those boots. Nobody but the agency was gonna see them. Whoever set them on that rock tied them back up because they wanted us to know they could. They? It. They. I don't have another word that fits. What do you mean by it, Henry? He smacked his lips a couple of times, then talked. You'll know when you see it. That's not a real answer. Sorry, bud. That's all I got. Anybody who tries to tell you more than that is selling you something. I've worked out here 40 years. I've heard the stories from the locals and the tribe and the old-timers at the agency, and most of these stories don't agree with each other on a single detail except one. Every person who's told me one of those stories said the same thing at the end of it. They said, "You'll know." There was a long, quiet moment. I was trying to figure out what to say or ask to pry more information out of him. But then he said, "I'll tell you the other thing they all said. They said don't go looking for it. If you see one, you don't ever go looking for it again on purpose. Some folks have, and most of those folks aren't around anymore to talk about how it went." That's the answer, kid. That's what I've got. He went back to his knife and whatever business he had with it. I knew that was him saying, "We're done here." I went back to my cabin that night, lay in my bunk, staring at the rafters. The rain had stopped, and the silence outside felt very creepy. It was that extra silent silence after a storm. I tried telling myself I didn't believe the old guy. I had a contract to finish up. I didn't have time to believe in some ghost story. Even so, I was a bit afraid of the dark that night. Several more contracts came and went over the following months. Then in October of 1995, I got the one that ended up changing things. The BLM was running this elk reduction program in a section of foothills north of Roosevelt, where the population had grown past what the range could carry, and they wanted somebody to bring the numbers down before winter. I took it without thinking twice. There was good pay to be had on this one, and the country was beautiful. And I knew the area from a previous coyote contract I'd run 2 years before. I was glad to be back. The work itself was straightforward. I had a 30-day window, a quota of 24 animals, and access to a Forest Service cabin about 6 miles up a graded road from the highway. I spent the first week scouting the herds in the early morning and late evening. By day 8, I'd taken 5 animals and was ahead of schedule. The day this happened was a Wednesday, in mid-October. It was easy for me to remember because it was my mom's birthday. I'd called her from a payphone in Roosevelt that morning before driving back up to my position. The weather had been clear all week. The aspens were peak yellow, and the air had a cold, dry edge to it. The snow line was starting to creep down the Uintas. I was set up on a low ridge overlooking a long meadow that ran along a creek bottom. The ridge was about 60 feet above the meadow, and from where I was, I could see about half a mile of the creek in either direction. Pine forest came in close on the far side. Aspens ran up the draws. My rifle was on a bipod, and I had the scope dialed in for the meadow's far edge, where a good bull had been showing up every other evening for the last 3 days. The light was just starting to soften, maybe an hour and a half before sunset. I had a thermos of coffee right next to me, and I was being patient. Patience is half the job on these contracts. I caught movement first in my peripheral vision, off to my left, way off where I hadn't been watching. Something was coming through the aspens above the creek and moving fast. Here come the elk, I thought. Maybe the herd had pushed a cow ahead of them and she was running. I swung the scope around. 2 women. 2 women were running through the aspens, moving downhill toward the meadow, both of them clearly in distress. The one in front was wearing a red fleece jacket and had dark hair in a long ponytail that was coming loose. The one behind her had on a green hiking pack and a navy beanie. She was struggling to keep up, but I could tell both of them were crying. Even at that distance, I could see it through my scope. Open mouths, twisted faces, that look of being past scared and into terrified territory. My first thought was that one of them was hurt. I scanned them for blood or limping, but I didn't see a sign of a wound. They were running flat out, panicked, looking back over their shoulders every few steps. I scanned behind them, up into the aspens. That's when I saw it. There was a figure following them. I thought it was a man, at first, or it looked like a man at least. He was tall, walking down the slope through the aspens, maybe 50 yards behind the 2 women. He was naked from the waist up. I want to say his skin was the color of bone, but that isn't quite right either. It was the color of dry pine, weathered, the color of something that had been outside for a season too long. He wasn't running. The 2 women were running, but he wasn't, and yet he was keeping up with them. That was the first thing my brain registered as completely wrong. He was walking, they were full-on sprinting, and the distance between them was staying exactly the same. I held the scope on this man, and I tried to focus. His face, I have to talk about that face. The left side, looking at him through the scope, was a young guy, somewhere in his 20s, with brown hair grown out a little, a normal jawline, a regular face you'd pass 100 times in town and never look at twice. The right side, however, was wrong. I didn't have words for it then. I still don't, really. The right side of his face was longer than the left. The jaw on that side hung lower, as though the bones underneath weren't matched up. The eye on that side was bigger and set wrong. The skin around it was a color that doesn't match anything I've ever seen on something alive. There was something about the place where the two halves came together at the center of the face that made my stomach turn just looking at it. The two halves didn't agree with each other. It was like two different beings had been stitched onto the same skull, and each one was ignoring the other. I lowered the scope and looked at the meadow with my naked eye. The two women were still running. I could see them now without the scope. Two small, desperate figures crossing the open grass, the red one out in front. I looked back to where I'd seen the man, but I could no longer pick him out without the scope. He was gone or hidden in the trees. I put the scope back to my eye. There he was. He was still there, the same distance behind them, and the same walking pace, never breaking stride. His ribcage rose and fell slowly, slower than any breathing I'd ever watched on anything alive. I'm a Kohler. My instinct is to put the rifle on a threat. I had a clear line of sight if I'd wanted it. I'll tell you something honest. I could not make myself center the crosshairs on him. Every time I tried to bring the scope onto his head, my hands started to shake. I'm not exaggerating. I've shot hundreds of animals. I've held a scope steady on a charging boar, but I could not put the crosshairs on that thing's face. My body just refused. The two women had reached the creek. The one in front was looking for a place to cross, frantic and splashing into the shallow part. The one behind her caught up, and they crossed together, water up to their knees, both of them stumbling. They came out the other side and kept running, heading for the road, which was about 200 yards beyond the meadow on my side. I swung the scope back to the figure. He had stopped at the edge of the aspens above the creek. He was looking down at the water. From my angle, I could see the wrong side of his face better now, and the longer I looked at it, the less I could focus on it. My eyes so badly wanted to look away at something, especially the normal half of his face. Looking at the wrong half made my brain feel raw and sore, as if I was pressing on something I should never touch. Then he turned his head. His head turned slow, and he looked across the meadow, across the creek, right up the ridge to where I was lying flat with my rifle. He looked at me through the scope, and I want to be very clear. He looked through the scope. He did not look at the ridge, generally. He did not scan the area around me. He locked onto the front lens of my rifle scope and threw it into my eye. I held my breath. My finger was on the trigger guard, not the trigger. I couldn't move. My whole body had gone cold and stupid. It was the kind of cold you feel when you wake up at night and just know something is in the room with you, something that shouldn't be there. He smiled at me then. The normal side of his face smiled. The other side did something that I can't even describe, but at best I could say it was like a tremor, a seizure on one half of the face only. Two halves of the same face doing completely different things. Then he turned and walked back up into the aspens. I held the scope on him until the trees swallowed him up. I kept it on the spot he'd disappeared into until my arms began to ache. When I finally lowered the rifle and got up off the ridge, my legs weren't working anymore. I slid most of the way back down the side of the ridge instead of climbing down. I got into my truck with my hands shaking, and I drove back to the cabin without remembering most of the road in between. I called dispatch from the cabin radio. I told them I had seen two female hikers running scared out of an area where there shouldn't have been hikers. I told them they'd been heading toward the highway, but they looked like they were in trouble. I gave them the location, the time, and a description of the two. One a red fleece, the other a green pack, and they both looked maybe in their late 20s. I wanted to say something about the man, but I didn't know how I could. I sat with the radio mic in my hand trying to find the right words, but eventually I just signed off. 2 hours later, dispatch called me back. They'd found the women, thankfully, both safe, picked up by a sheriff's deputy on the highway, about 3 miles south of where I'd seen them cross the creek. They were shaken up, but unhurt. They told the deputy they'd been hiking and got lost. Then they got scared, because they thought they heard something following them in the woods. The deputy logged it as a lost hiker incident, and that was the end of it. But that wasn't a lost hiker situation that I saw. I watched them closely through my scope. They knew exactly where they were. They were running from something specific. The next day, I drove down to the BLM field office in Roosevelt and asked to speak to my supervisor. He was a guy named Blum. He was in his 50s, ex-military, polite enough, but never anything you'd call warm. He took me into his office and shut the door. I told him everything I'd seen, walking him through it slowly, play by play. I told him, of course, about the 2 women in the meadow, and about the figure that had come down through the aspens behind them. I told him about the face being wrong on one side, and about how the figure had stopped at the edge of the trees and turned to look directly at me through my scope. Blum listened without interrupting. He nodded a couple of times. He took a few notes on a yellow pad. When I finished, he set the pen down and folded his hands on his desk. "You doing okay out there?" he said. That wasn't the response I expected. "What do you mean?" "I mean, are you sleeping enough out there? You eating good? You've been on this contract by yourself for what? Almost 2 weeks now." "I sleep fine, sir. I eat good. And I know what I saw." Blum picked up the pen again and tapped it against his pad, but he didn't write down anything. Then he started in gently. "Tell me what you've been eating out there," he said. "What?" "Out at the cabin. Walk me through a day for you. Breakfast, lunch, what you carry in your pack." "Blum, I don't see what that has to do with anything. Just humor me." I told him. Coffee in the morning, jerky and a granola bar in the pack, whatever I cooked at the cabin in the evening, usually canned chili or pasta. He nodded along with every part of it. "Do you ever get lightheaded out there? Hands shaky on the rifle? Anything like that? 2 weeks alone in the field, eating like that, a man can run his blood sugar pretty low without realizing it." My hands weren't shaky. "What time of day did you see this?" "Maybe an hour and a half before sunset, but the light was still good. Right around the time the light starts doing things. You ever notice that? That hour when the shadows get long, you can pick up movement out of the corner of your eye that isn't really there, especially through a scope. Especially when you've had a scope to your eye for an hour or two waiting on a bull. The brain gets tired, you start filling things in, you know." I sat there and listened to him do this. I'd been on enough contracts to know what was happening. He wasn't asking me questions. He was offering me an explanation, gently, almost coaxing me into it. He wanted me to walk out of his office having decided what I saw was some mirage caused by tiredness. "Blum, I appreciate the concern, but I'm not tired. My blood sugar is fine, and I know what I saw." There was a flicker of something on his face, a half-second where the concerned supervisor look slipped, and something else had come through. There was nothing surprised about it. The flicker instead was annoyance. A man hoping he wouldn't have to do the next part of his job. It came and went so fast I nearly missed it. Then that fake concern was back on his face. "Tell you what, take a couple of days, stay at the cabin or head home, my treat. I'll cover you with the contract office. I've seen plenty of guys need a breather around the 2-week mark. Not a big deal, just think about it, okay? I don't need days off." "I didn't ask you, son. I'm offering. You think about it." Then he leaned forward. "And in the meantime, do me a favor. Don't talk about this with anybody. I'm not just talking about the guys at the field stations. I mean, anybody at all. including the locals in town, including your own mother on the phone. The agency has its own process for this kind of thing, and I don't want the reports to get muddied. That part gave me chills. Blum was a man who said things directly, never with much heat behind them. This time there was something behind his words, a little bit of warning, a little bit of pressure, almost a threat. This man wasn't asking me to keep quiet. He was telling me. I told him I'd think about it. I left his office and walked out to my truck, sitting there in the cab. I had to make myself turn the key. I knew. By the time I was driving back to the cabin, I knew it for sure. Blum had not been surprised by my story. He had been waiting on it. Maybe not from me specifically, but he'd been waiting for someone to come into his office with a story like the one I had just told him. And he had a script ready. A script he'd run through in order. That night I sat in the cabin and just thought. Henry's story kept coming back at me. The boots set out on that rock with the laces tied. Caleb walking out the cabin door at 3 a.m. and never being seen again. And under all of it sat the figure across the meadow, looking right up at the ridge at me, smiling with half of a face that did not agree with itself. The thing that stuck with me hardest was that smile. He'd known I was there, from a quarter mile of cover, with nothing showing but the front lens of a rifle scope. He had known, and he wanted me to know that he knew. That was the start of me believing. I tried to convince myself the worst of it was over. Blum had told me to take a couple of days off, and I figured I'd use them to clear my head. I'd stay at the cabin, finish out the rest of the contract, and put what happened behind me. The smarter version of me would have packed up that night, driven back to my mom's house in Salt Lake. The version of me sitting in that cabin in 1995 was 24 years old and stubborn, and did not want to walk away from a contract he was already halfway through. That first night was when things started to feel wrong in an entirely different way. After staying in that cabin long enough, I knew its sounds. The floorboards settled when the temperature dropped, and there was a squirrel in the rafters that ran across the roof at sunrise. I'd gotten used to all of it and slept through it just fine. That first night was different. I lay in the bunk with my eyes open until past 1 in the morning. Every time I started to drift off, my brain would replay the figure standing at the edge of the aspens, looking up the ridge through my scope, and I'd be wide awake again. Around 2 in the morning, I gave up trying to sleep and got up to make coffee. That's when I heard the first thing. It came from the woods behind the cabin, about 20 yards in the pines. I heard a voice from the trees, a woman's voice calling out, hurt and trying to be heard. She was calling out a name. She was begging for someone to come find her. I stood there listening with the coffee pot in my hand, and something under my conscious brain started to slow me down. The voice was a little too clear. Out in those woods 20 yards back in the pines, you wouldn't hear a person calling that clean. The trees and brush should have softened it. The wind should have carried pieces of it away. The voice I was hearing was coming through with no interference at all, as clean as a recording. Then I caught myself. I sat there in the cabin with the coffee pot in my hand. I hadn't moved. My body had already known something I hadn't worked out yet. I was a quarter mile up a graded road from the highway, on a section of Forest Service land where there were no trailheads inside 3 miles. The closest residence was 8 miles south. There shouldn't have been a hiker at 2 in the morning, 20 yards from my cabin. There definitely shouldn't have been one yelling for help in a perfect, clear voice from the middle of the trees. I set the coffee pot down. I didn't go to the radio or the door. I sat down on the floor with my back to the wall facing the door, and I picked up my rifle. I waited. The voice kept calling for about 10 minutes, then it stopped. I sat by the wall with the rifle across my lap until the sun came up. I never heard anything else. The night stayed silent until light came through the window. In the morning, I made myself drive into Roosevelt for breakfast. The diner was open. I had eggs and coffee and tried to act normal. The waitress was a woman named Dee, who had served me on every contract I'd worked out of Roosevelt, going back 2 years. She filled my cup and asked how the elk hunt was going. I told her it was going fine. She looked at me a bit longer than usual, topped my cup off again even though it didn't need it, and walked away without saying another word. I left her a bigger tip than I usually left, and I got out of there. I kept thinking about what Blum had said about not talking to anyone. I assumed he told me that for 2 reasons. The agency wanted to control the story, sure, but underneath that, he'd been warning me about something else, something he'd let slip without meaning to. That something else was the part I couldn't shake. Blum had told me not to mention it, as if mentioning it out loud would make it worse, as if speaking about the thing was part of the problem. I drove out to the field station that afternoon, and I looked for Henry. He wasn't there. The duty officer told me Henry had wrapped up his last consulting day and had gone home, so he wasn't expected back. I asked for a phone number. The duty officer said agency policy didn't allow him to give that out. I drove back to my cabin and sat on the porch step with my rifle across my knees, and I watched the tree line until the light went. That night was quiet, and the night after that was too. I started to think maybe the first night had been a fluke, a bad night and nothing more. Day 3 after the meeting, I went back out to my position on the ridge. I needed to finish the contract. The bull I'd been waiting on had been showing up regular, and I had a quota to meet. I told myself I was being a professional, and that I wasn't going to let one bad night cost me the second half of my pay. I set up. I got prone behind the rifle. I scanned the meadow. The bull came up out of the trees on schedule, big 6-point, exactly where I'd been expecting him. I had him in the scope, breathing slow, finger on the trigger guard. Then he picked his head up and looked across the meadow. He was looking at the same edge of aspens where that figure had been 3 days before. His ears swiveled forward. His whole body went stiff. He wasn't grazing anymore. He was watching something. I held very still. I didn't put the scope on the aspens. Whatever that bull saw, I didn't want anything to do with it. After about 30 seconds, the bull turned and walked back into the trees on his side of the meadow. He wasn't running, just walking, head still turned toward the aspens until he was out of sight. I packed up, and I went back to the cabin. That night would be another bad night. It started around midnight. I was in bed, but not asleep. I'd been keeping the rifle on the bunk next to me since the first night. I heard footsteps on the porch. A single set of footsteps came across the porch and stopped at the door. I lay there with my hand on the rifle and my heart trying to climb out of my chest. The footsteps had been heavy, the weight of a man. Then I heard breathing. It was right on the other side of the door, slow, slower than any breathing should be. It was the same slow breath I'd watched on the figure across the meadow when he'd been walking down the slope through the aspens. I didn't move or speak. I didn't even reach for the rifle, even though it was right there, because some part of me had already understood that picking up the rifle would make this worse. I lay there with my eyes on the door and listened to it breathe. It stayed at the door for I don't know how long. Eventually, the breathing stopped. I never heard footsteps go back across the porch. The breathing was there and then it wasn't, and the porch was empty. I waited for the sun. When the light came through the curtains, I made myself open the door. The porch was empty. I checked the dust on the boards for prints and found none. Whatever had stood there had not left a single mark, just like Henry's story. That morning was when I packed up. I left the cabin and drove back to my mom's house in Salt Lake. I called Blum from her kitchen phone and told him I was taking the rest of those days he'd offered. He sounded relieved. He told me to take a week if needed. For the first few nights at my mom's place, I slept with the lights on. I know she noticed, but she didn't ask why. She knew something had happened on the contract. After all, she had raised me. She could read me. But all I said was that it had been a hard one, and I was tired. She made me French toast, my favorite. I tried Henry one more time. I called the field station one day, but they said they'd pass on a message because he wasn't there. But he called me back 2 days later from a payphone in Vernal. I explained everything that had happened at the cabin. The voice from the trees, the bulls staring at the aspens, the footsteps and breathing. I told him about the dust on the boards in the morning, how it had not been touched. He listened intently. I could hear traffic on his end. He was on a payphone near a road. When I finished talking, he was quiet for a moment and said, "You stopped talking about it, didn't you?" After Blum's office, yeah, I kept it shut. That's good. You keep it shut. The thing you saw out there knows you saw it because you were looking at it through that scope. It locks onto attention. You stop giving it any. Far as anybody outside this conversation is concerned, that meadow never happened. You hear me? Yeah. Did anything follow you home from that cabin? I told him I didn't think so. I'd checked the truck before I left. I hadn't heard anything I couldn't explain since I got back to my mom's. Good. That part is important. Sometimes one of them latches on, and the people that happens to don't get to live normal anymore. They have to do other things to break it loose. You don't sound like one of them. What kind of other things? He ignored that question. Maybe by accident, maybe on purpose. The rest is gonna fade. Give it a few weeks. Long as you don't talk about it, and you don't sit on it in your head, it goes back to whatever it does when nobody's paying attention. But it remembers you, so you keep watching, just in case. What do you mean by watching? He took a breath on the other end. You'll know. That was all he gave me. He told me to call him if anything else happened, and not to call him if it didn't. We hung up. Henry was right about it fading. I went back out 2 weeks later and finished the elk contract, and I didn't see anything I couldn't explain. I came in under quota, got my pay, and accepted the next contract that came up. I worked the Uintah Basin for another 9 years after that. I never saw anything as clear as what I'd seen in that meadow. There were nights I felt watched. Some mornings I'd find tracks near my cabin or near my truck that didn't match any animal I ever knew. But nothing ever came close to what I'd seen across that creek. I followed Henry's rules. I didn't talk about it with anyone, including my mom, not even when I was dating somebody serious. When someone at a hardware store or bar mentioned the word in passing, I'd nod and change the subject. For about 30 years, I kept my word. I stayed quiet, kept working contracts in the basin until I aged out of the long ones. Then I worked shorter contracts in northern Utah until I retired in 2018. I had a couple of long-term relationships but never married, never had kids. I'm telling you all of this because I want you to understand. I've thought a lot about whether to say anything. I made a choice to stay quiet for almost 30 years, so when I tell you I'm choosing to break that silence now, understand it's not on a whim. I'm reaching out now because I'm getting older, and I've been thinking too much. I think about the people in that BLM office who knew exactly what I was reporting and decided to feed me a line about blood sugar. I keep coming back to Caleb's family who got a death certificate and some story about a ledge. And I think about those 2 women in the meadow who got logged as a lost hiker incident and probably went home trying to convince themselves that what they saw was a bear or a man with a knife. So what I want to tell you is that the government knows. Put that on record. The agencies know about it, all of them, and somebody well above Blum's pay grade has been managing the story for longer than I've been alive. I'd bet good money on it that it goes back further than that, a lot further. People who report things get the blood sugar lecture and the offer of a couple days off. People who push back get nudged toward signing something or going home for good. The people who could have told this story alongside me are mostly gone. Wes died in 2014, Henry in 2008, and Ben moved to Arizona 27 years ago. I've never been able to find him since. Henry was the only one I ever told the full story to, and he was the only person who ever told me how to handle what comes after. I'm breaking my silence now because Henry is not around to tell me to keep my mouth shut anymore. 30 years go by. He told me to keep watching just in case. And I've kept watching because there are skinwalkers in those woods. It's crazy how you don't even need much action or face-to-face terror in a skinwalker story like this to walk away feeling like you need 3 showers a day and twice the wattage in every light fixture in your home. Remember, when you speak of them, they will come. So be careful what you say. Good night. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Tales from the Break Room. I've been your host, Darkness Prevails, and I need your help. If you want EerieCast and Tales from the Break Room to keep going, think about signing up for membership over at Eerie.fm. That's EERIE.fm. It's the new best place to listen to EerieCast shows like this. And if you sign up for premium, you unlock tons of extra hours of my narrations that you can't get anywhere else. Thank you so much. Until next time, everyone, I'll be clocking out, but I'll be back again real soon.